When we picture history, we imagine neat timelines filled with names and dates, each event following the last like stones across a river. But that image is a comforting illusion. Most of history is gone, burned, buried, or deliberately erased. Scrolls turned to ash, temples crumbled into dust. Libraries were sacked by conquerors, and entire civilizations vanished, leaving behind only fragments, a chipped statue, a carved line on stone, a rumor in a forgotten chronicle. Between those fragments lies silence, and in that silence, imagination begins to stir. What secrets were lost when the Maya codices burned in the 16th century? Who built the megaliths scattered across South America? How many untold stories still sit trapped in untranscribed clay tablets from Mesopotamia? Sometimes the missing pieces are centuries long, like the dark stretches of history after Rome's fall. Other times, they're entire cultures swallowed by jungle or sand, erased so completely their names are gone. This isn't a lecture or a tidy timeline, it's a journey. Together, we'll sift through what remains. Fragments of pottery, broken inscriptions, stories half remembered. Some are tiny puzzles, like an undeciphered symbol. Others are vast mysteries, civilizations undone by time, disease or conquest. We begin not with a great empire, but with a few pieces of clay unearthed in Romania, artifacts that may hold the first whispers of human writing. In 1961, archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa was excavating near the village of Tartaria when his team found 3 small tablets unlike anything else in Europe. They were discovered alongside 2 figurines and the skeleton of a woman carefully buried, perhaps a priestess or shaman. Each tablet was pressed with precise symbols, crosses, chevrons, zigzags, and abstract shapes. They were simple, crude even, but deliberate. When the surrounding material was dated, it shocked researchers. Around 5300 BC, that would make them more than 1,000 years older than the earliest Sumerian cuneiform. If the dating held, it meant writing, or something close to it, might have been born not in Mesopotamia, but in southeastern Europe. The tablet's symbols seem organized, not random. One features a cross motif surrounded by lines. Another shows rows of marks, like an early ledger. There are only about a dozen unique signs, but they repeat in patterns suggesting structure or meaning. Were they records of trade or ritual? Proto-writing? Or were they sacred symbols with no linguistic content at all? Their connection to the broader Vinca culture offers clues. Across the Balkans, thousands of Vinca artifacts bear similar markings, lines and symbols etched into pottery and figurines. Some scholars believe these signs formed a symbolic system, perhaps even a primitive script. Others insist they were decorative, their meanings entirely ritual or religious. The mystery deepens because the burial complicates context. The tablets may not have been documents in the practical sense, but ceremonial objects buried with the dead. Their purpose might have been spiritual, never meant to be read. Worse, soon after discovery, Vlasa fired the fragile tablets in a kiln to preserve them, destroying the possibility of dating the clay directly. Some have argued they're younger than the burial context, suggests perhaps 3000 BC instead of 5300 BC. Others propose they were imports, carried from Mesopotamia or Anatolia and buried in Romania centuries later. But no one can prove it. There are no other artifacts quite like them. Still, when you place the Tartaria symbols beside early Sumerian signs, the resemblance is uncanny. The possibility that writing began twice, independently, remains both thrilling and unsettling. If true, it would redraw the map of civilization's beginnings, but the tablets may not be words at all, just a ritual code that led nowhere. We may never know. What's certain is that 3 fragile pieces of clay, found in a forgotten grave, have forced us to question one of humanity's proudest assumptions, that we know where our story began. From symbols pressed into clay, we move to another kind of silence, one written into Scripture itself. The Bible tells us of Jesus as a child in the temple, debating with priests at age 12. Then suddenly he disappears. For nearly 20 years, the record goes dark. When he reappears at the Jordan River to be baptized by John, he's 30. Between those moments, nothing. Perhaps those years were ordinary. Maybe he lived quietly in Nazareth, working as a craftsman, supporting his family, living the rhythms of a small Galilean town. But for centuries, the blank pages have inspired speculation. Some believe he traveled to Egypt, to India, even to Britain, learning from sages and teachers. Others suggest his silence was deliberate, a time of preparation rather than absence. Ancient writers offered little. The apocryphal Gospels add fantastical details, childhood miracles, journeys, lessons, but they're centuries too late to trust. In the 19th century, a Russian traveler claimed to have found a Tibetan manuscript describing Isa, a prophet from the West who studied in India. It made headlines, but no proof ever surfaced. Still, the story persists, part of humanity's attempt to fill the silence. The truth may be simpler. The Gospel writers cared more about his message than his youth. Yet the gap remains, a reminder that even the lives we think we know best are full of missing years. When Rome fell in 476 AD, the world entered another silence. The written record thins almost to nothing. For centuries afterward, Europe's history exists mostly in fragments, coins, pottery, scattered chronicles. Compared to Rome's bureaucratic abundance of texts, the centuries that followed feel like pages torn from a book. We call it the Dark Ages, though perhaps it was only dark to our eyes. People still farmed, traded, prayed, and ruled, but fewer wrote it down. Literacy retreated into monasteries, and monks became the keepers of memory. The few surviving chronicles, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or the Irish annals, are patchy and incomplete. Then there's the dust veil of 36 AD. Contemporary writers described the sun is dim and cold for over a year. Crops failed, famine spread, and tree ring data confirms a massive global cooling event, likely from a volcanic eruption. It was one of the worst climate disasters in recorded history, yet we have barely a handful of lines describing it. The rest is silence. Archaeology becomes our historian here. Ship burials like Sutton Hoo, Viking hordes, Byzantine coins in northern Europe. These fragments speak where words are gone. They tell us that civilization didn't collapse. It merely stopped keeping notes. Sometimes the missing pieces lead to strange theories, like the phantom time hypothesis, the claim that 3 centuries of history were fabricated, that Charlemagne never existed. It's wrong, of course, but it reflects a deeper discomfort. How much of history is guesswork built atop absence? And yet, amid this uncertainty, life continued. Kingdoms rose. Christianity spread. Monks copied what they could. The silence of the record doesn't mean stillness. It only means the ink ran out. From that historical void, we travel further back to prehistory, where the first cities of Europe emerged not in stone, but in clay and timber. Across modern Ukraine and Moldova, archaeologists have uncovered vast circular settlements belonging to the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, flourishing between 5000 and 3000 BC, seen from above. The remains form immense spirals, rings of houses, each nearly identical, arranged with geometric precision. Some stretched for miles, home to tens of thousands of people. 2-story dwellings, ovens, workshops, woven textiles, and artful pottery painted in red, black, and white. These weren't primitive villages. They were organized, communal, and sophisticated, possibly the largest settlements on Earth at the time, long before Sumer or Egypt built their cities. Yet they left behind no palaces, no fortresses, and no writing. Power may have been collective, not centralized, and then, around 3000 BC, they vanished. Many sites show signs of deliberate burning, not destruction by enemies, but ritual cleansing. Perhaps the people burned their homes in ceremony before moving on. Perhaps they overfarmed their land or fled climate change. Whatever the reason, their cities were swallowed by the earth, leaving behind only patterns in the soil and pottery fragments that still shine with strange beauty. Like so many others, they slipped into silence, History is less a continuous story than a constellation of fragments. Between each light lies darkness, the spaces where memory failed, where words were lost, where time itself forgot. But in those spaces, the imagination keeps digging, hoping that somewhere beneath the layers of dust and silence, the past still waits to speak. The Cucuteni Tripilia people lived during the moment when Europe was shifting from stone to metal, and their artifacts show that they understood that change was happening. By 3000 BC, their vast settlements were suddenly abandoned. Some believe migrating steppe tribes from the east, early Indo-Europeans, forced them out. Others think internal decline or environmental exhaustion brought their civilization down. Whatever the reason, their great concentric towns fell silent, and Europe would not see urban life on such a scale again for thousands of years. Their story challenges the traditional narrative of where complex societies first emerged. For decades, the spotlight rested on Mesopotamia and Egypt, the so-called cradles of civilization. Yet in the fields of modern Ukraine and Moldova, 1,000 years before the first pharaohs, tens of thousands of people lived in organized settlements, crafted fine pottery, and built homes in carefully planned layouts. If these proto-cities had endured, the center of the world's first urban history might have been written not along the Tigris or Nile, but on the plains of Eastern Europe. It's worth imagining the comparison. Around 3500 BC, cities like Uruk were only beginning to grow in Mesopotamia. By 3100 BC, Egypt was uniting under its first kings. Yet back in the Tripilia heartland, enormous settlements already housed populations rivaling or surpassing those early urban centers. Their scale defies expectations. Circular cities, some stretching across miles, appearing centuries before urban life was supposed to exist. Why did they vanish? The evidence is ambiguous. Soil exhaustion, climate shifts, or depletion of resources might have made such large communities unsustainable. Others point to the arrival of steppe nomads, bringing new technologies and perhaps conflict. Some archaeologists even think the burn layers found at many sites suggest ritual destruction, an act of renewal or abandonment woven into their belief system. Whatever the truth, their disappearance left a silence that archaeology can only partly fill. Europe's first great settlements disappeared before history began to record them. From these lost proto-cities, we move south to the Nile Valley, where another mystery in early civilization unfolds. Egypt's story officially begins around 3100 BC, when Narmer, sometimes called Menes, unified Upper and Lower Egypt and became the first pharaoh. But the centuries before that are hazy. Along the river, cultures thrived, creating art, wealth, and symbols that look like the earliest writing. Yet in the historical record they almost vanish, overshadowed by the dynasties that followed. The Badarian culture, dating to around 4400–4000 BC, is Egypt's earliest known farming society. They grew grain, raised cattle, and crafted simple but elegant black-topped red pottery. Their burials were careful, with bodies laid toward the west, grave goods placed beside them, and a clear belief in an afterlife centuries before the pyramids. They were succeeded by the Naqada culture, which unfolded in 3 phases between roughly 4000 and 3100 BC. Over that time, everything accelerated, pottery became intricate, decorated with boats and animals, and tools improved. Trade expanded as lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and cedar from Lebanon made their way into Egypt. Then, around 3100 BC, history seems to leap forward. Writing appears. Monumental tombs rise at Abydos. Kingship arrives fully formed. The transition is so sudden that it almost feels like a missing chapter. How did a patchwork of farming villages become one of the world's first centralized states? At Abydos, one burial, known as Tomb Uj, offers clues. Dating to about 3200 BC, it contained ivory tags marked with the earliest hieroglyphic symbols, likely used to label jars of goods. This suggests that both writing and rulership existed before Narmer. Later Egyptian king lists also refer to rulers predating him, often called the Dynasty Zero kings, including mysterious figures known as Scorpion the Fine and Tu. Carvings show these rulers wearing crowns and presiding over organized rituals. Were they the real founders of Egypt, later erased to simplify the narrative? The sudden rise of dynastic Egypt seems less miraculous when viewed through these fragments. There must have been generations of experimentation, chieftains consolidating power, artisans refining symbols into writing, and local leaders building ever larger tombs. Floods, wars, or deliberate omission may have erased many traces. The crowns that symbolize unification already appear in earlier art, suggesting continuity from forgotten rulers to Nama himself. Even Egypt's theology, the belief in an afterlife, divine kingship and cosmic order didn't appear out of nowhere. It likely evolved from the spiritual traditions of these prehistoric cultures, shaped by centuries of myth and ritual we can no longer reconstruct. If Nama wasn't the first king, then who was? Was it the ruler buried in Tomb UJ who left the first written labels? Was it one of the shadowy Scorpion kings? Or someone whose name lies buried still beneath the desert? The sands of Egypt hold those answers, but for now, they remain silent. That silence leads us across the ocean to Mesoamerica, where another mystery is carved not in stone temples or royal tombs, but in a single green slab. In the late 1990s, road workers in Veracruz, Mexico, unearthed a small serpentine stone, later known as the Cascajal block. It bears 62 distinct symbols, arranged in neat horizontal rows. Some depict corn kernels, insects, and thrones. Others are abstract loops and ovals. The block dates to around 900 BC, placing it in the era of the Olmec civilization, the so-called mother culture of Mesoamerica, known for its colossal heads and sacred centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta. If the block represents true writing, it would make the Olmecs the earliest literate civilization in the Americas, predating the Maya script by centuries. Its order, repetition, and spacing suggest language rather than decoration, but no other examples have been found. Without a second text, decipherment is impossible. Some scholars doubt its genuine writing, pointing to its uncertain discovery context. It was found by chance, not in a controlled excavation. Yet its material, motifs, and style fit Olmec traditions perfectly. It's possible that the Olmecs experimented with recording language on perishable materials, bark paper, textiles, or wooden tablets that have long since rotted away. The Cascajal block may be the last surviving page of an entire written tradition now lost. Look at it beside a Maya codex. The Maya glyphs are complex and phonetic, while the Cascajal symbols are simpler but follow the same principle, organized signs conveying meaning. Perhaps this was a prototype, a first step toward literacy that ended before it spread. If that's true, then somewhere in ancient Veracruz there may once have been libraries of painted scrolls and carved monuments. All gone now, lost to time, humidity, or conquest. The block remains the only voice of a vanished language, a whisper from a civilization that shaped Mesoamerica's future, yet left almost no words behind. From that single stone, we move to a very different kind of archive, one where words were preserved not on paper or bark, but in clay. Long before the Library of Alexandria, there was Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, where King Ashurbanipal built one of the world's first great libraries. Ruling from 668 to 627 BC, Ashurbanipal commanded an empire that stretched from Egypt to Persia, but his greatest conquest was knowledge. He could read and write in both Akkadian and Sumerian, an unusual skill for a king, and he sent scribes across his realm to collect every text they could find. They returned with myths, hymns, medical recipes, laws, rituals, and astronomical records, all pressed into clay tablets. By the time the library was complete, it held perhaps 40,000 pieces. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest great poem, which survived only because of this collection. There were dictionaries, omen lists, treaties, and scientific texts, an entire civilization encoded in wedges of clay. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, fire swept through the city, destroying palaces but hardening the tablets, preserving them for millennia. Rediscovered in the mid-19th century, the library transformed our understanding of Mesopotamian history. Even now, thousands of fragments remain untranslated in museum archives. Each one could contain a forgotten myth, a royal letter, or a piece of lost science. The Library of Ashurbanipal shows that knowledge, if written in the right medium, can outlast empires. But not every mystery is about what survived. Some are about what was never real, yet lived for centuries in the human imagination. West of Ireland, sailors once swore there was an island called High Brazil. It appeared on maps for hundreds of years, a perfect circle, sometimes split in two by a channel. Irish legends described it as a mist-shrouded paradise that appeared only once every 7 years. In the 1400s and 1500s, explorers sailed out searching for it. Convinced it was real, captains reported glimpses of it, even claimed to have landed there, telling stories of strange animals and gifts of silver. The island's name came from the old Irish word bress, meaning mighty or great. Over time, mapmakers kept copying it from one chart to another until it became a fixture of Atlantic geography. Eventually, the searches stopped. No island was ever found. Scientists today think the legends were born from mirages, optical illusions caused by atmospheric refraction, projecting distant coastlines above the horizon. But for centuries, High Brazil lived as both myth and destination, a place halfway between imagination and reality, like so many of history's missing pieces, from lost cities and unread tablets to phantom islands. It reminds us that the line between what once was and what we only believe was is thinner than we think. When the Bronze Age ended and the Iron Age began, the question of who or what caused the collapse of that interconnected world became one of history's great debates. Some scholars blame the mysterious sea peoples, waves of migrating raiders who overwhelmed weakened kingdoms across the Mediterranean. Others see them as symptoms rather than causes, part of a broader crisis already underway. Climate records suggest severe droughts may have led to famine, while evidence of widespread earthquakes points to natural disaster. Social unrest may have added to the chaos, as populations turned against rulers who could no longer maintain stability. It was likely a perfect storm of disasters hitting a network so interdependent that once one part failed, the rest quickly followed. Even Egypt, which survived the invasions, emerged scarred and diminished. Ramses III proclaimed victory, but his empire never again reached its former strength. The Hittites disappeared completely. Mycenaean Greece collapsed into centuries of poverty and illiteracy, remembered later as the Greek Dark Age. Out of the ashes, the Iron Age was born. The Bronze Age collapse didn't just shatter political systems, it left marks in myth and memory. Many scholars think Greek tales of wandering heroes, of Troy's destruction, and of migrations across the sea preserve faint echoes of these upheavals. The Sea Peoples remain the story's most vivid symbol, depicted in Egyptian reliefs with feathered helmets, ox-drawn carts, and families in tow. Were they one people, or a loose alliance bound by desperation? Some may have settled in Canaan, becoming the Philistines of the Bible. Others may have merged into new cultures whose names history forgot. What makes the collapse so gripping is how suddenly it happened. One generation saw the kings of Ugarit writing letters to Egypt. The next saw their cities in ruins. Trade routes that had carried tin and copper for centuries went silent. Writing systems vanished. For hundreds of years, the Eastern Mediterranean had to rebuild its knowledge and order from almost nothing. Picture a map where once thriving lines of trade and diplomacy suddenly blink out, leaving only isolated points where great kingdoms once stood. The disaster was total, economic, cultural and technological, and its shock reshaped the ancient world. Whether the Sea Peoples were destroyers or refugees remains uncertain. Were they the spark that ignited the fire, or travelers swept up in a storm of collapse? The evidence is too fragmentary to say. What is clear is that the Bronze Age collapse stands as one of the most dramatic turning points in history, a reminder of how even the mightiest systems can unravel in the space of a single lifetime. While the ruins of the Bronze Age crumbled around the Mediterranean, far to the east another mystery was quietly being built in stone. Across the Korean peninsula, from the mountains of Gangwon to the fields of Jeolla, thousands of massive slabs of rock still stand. They dot ridges, cluster near rivers, and appear in the middle of modern towns, wedged between roads and apartment blocks. These are Korea's dolmens, prehistoric megaliths so numerous that more than half of the world's examples are found there. The scale is staggering. Archaeologists estimate at least 30,000 dolmens remain, though some counts go higher. Korea alone has more of them than all of Europe, the Middle East and Africa combined. In regions like Gochang, Hwasun and Gangwon, entire fields of dolmens stretch for kilometers, earning UNESCO recognition for their cultural and historical value. The dolmens vary in form. The table style, large upright stones supporting a flat capstone, is the most recognizable. Others are simpler, single massive blocks laid directly over burial pits. Southern dolmens tend to be larger and heavier, northern ones smaller and more compact, but all required immense labor. Some stones weigh more than 100 tons, raised and balanced without the use of wheels or metal cranes. How they were moved remains uncertain. Earth ramps, log rollers, ropes of twisted fiber, all have been proposed and unproven. Most archaeologists believe the dolmens were tombs for elite individuals during Korea's Bronze Age, around 1000 BC or earlier. Beneath some, remains have been found, though the acidic soil often destroys bone. More often, bronze daggers, jade ornaments, and stone tools are discovered, suggesting burials of chiefs or warriors. The scale of construction implies organized societies capable of mobilizing large workforces. The dolmens were not just graves, they were statements of power. They also reflect broader patterns of belief and hierarchy. The larger the monument, the greater the prestige of the person buried below. Some dolmens align with mountains, rivers, or celestial bodies, hinting at ritual or astronomical significance. Others stand on ridges overlooking plains, visible for miles, a possible claim of territory or display of dominance. Dolmens are found worldwide, from Ireland to India, yet nowhere as densely as in Korea. In Europe, they belong mostly to the Neolithic era, but in Korea they appear much later, overlapping with the Bronze Age. This has led scholars to wonder whether the practice arose independently or through distant cultural echoes carried across Eurasia. Folklore offers its own explanations. In Korean legends, dolmens were said to be dropped by giants or gods. Villagers treated them as sacred places, and some still are. Even today, dolmens are woven into local identity, half monument, half ancestor, but for all their size, they tell us almost nothing about the people who built them. Korea's Bronze Age left no written record. The dolmens are the only monumental trace of societies otherwise lost. Their languages, myths, and daily lives are unknown. Archaeologists can study the stones and the few artifacts that remain, but the builders' thoughts are silent. Some dolmens form vast clusters, others stand alone. In Gochang, a capstone 7 meters long dwarfs those around it. In Gangwon, rows of dolmens seem to follow patterns that may have symbolic meaning. Yet interpretation is uncertain. Perhaps they were cemeteries, perhaps sanctuaries, perhaps both. To visualize the scale, imagine a map of Korea covered in dots, tens of thousands of them, most concentrated in the southwest. It is a constellation of stone across the land, unmatched anywhere else. Why this intensity here? One idea is competition among local chieftains, each trying to outdo the others with grander tombs. Another is that dolmens marked claims to land or trade routes, asserting control over fertile valleys and river crossings. Despite decades of research, Many remain unexcavated, hidden under vegetation, or built over by modern development. Archaeologists continue to fight for their protection, knowing that each stone may conceal a story thousands of years old. The mystery endures. Why Korea, and why so many? The stones do not answer. They stand as mute witnesses to a vanished age, marking the boundary between history and prehistory. If the dolmens of Korea leave us thousands of stones but no words, the Celts of ancient Europe left the opposite. Words unspoken, but art and influence everywhere. The Celts once stretched from Ireland to Anatolia, from the Atlantic to the fringes of Asia Minor, yet they left almost no writing of their own. Their voices were silenced not by time, but by choice. The reason lies with the Druids, the priestly and intellectual class of Celtic society. Roman accounts describe them as keepers of law, religion, and philosophy, but they forbade writing down sacred knowledge. To them, wisdom was preserved through memory and oral teaching. Students spent years, even decades, memorizing verses, laws, and genealogies. When the Romans conquered Celtic lands, the Druids were suppressed, their oral tradition extinguished. What remains are fragments, inscriptions in the Ogham script, carved on stone pillars in early medieval Ireland. Most are simple: names, boundaries, dedications. They are echoes, not voices. Nearly everything else we know about the Celts comes from outsiders. Caesar described their customs, but through Roman eyes. Greek and later Roman writers saw them as fierce, superstitious, and barbaric, stereotypes that masked complexity. The Celts built sophisticated societies, created exquisite metalwork, and maintained far-reaching trade networks. Yet their own words, myths, philosophies, histories are gone. Archaeology shows their artistry, talks of gold and silver, ceremonial shields, and vessels like the Gundestrup cauldron, covered in images of gods and rituals we can no longer interpret. Sites like Bibract in Gaul and Tara in Ireland show urban planning and monumental construction. But without texts, their beliefs remain speculation. Imagine a library with shelves of Greek and Roman writings beside a single row of Celtic artifacts. Beautiful, silent, unreadable. That is the imbalance history left us. The Celts shaped Europe for centuries, but we hear them only through the voices of their conquerors. Their philosophy, which Roman writers hinted was profound, disappeared. Their stories, passed orally, survived only where monks later wrote them down in Christianized form. Their silence stands in contrast to another civilization that spoke early and clearly, China's Shang dynasty. The Shang ruled from around 1600 to 1046 BC and gave East Asia its first written language. Yet most of their words have also vanished. What survives are oracle bones, animal bones and turtle shells inscribed with questions to the gods. The cracks formed when they were heated were interpreted as answers, and scribes recorded both the question and the outcome. Alongside these, inscriptions on bronze ritual vessels preserve names and dedications. These fragments form the earliest written Chinese. But they are fragments all the same. The Shang must have produced other records, annals, myths, instructions, but these were written on bamboo or silk, materials that decayed long ago. When the Zhou conquered the Shang, they destroyed or absorbed much of their culture. For centuries afterward, villages near Anyang unknowingly dug up oracle bones and sold them as dragon bones for medicine, until scholars recognized the carvings in the 1890s and realized they were the remains of China's first writing. The oracle bones tell of harvests, wars, sacrifices, and royal lineages. They confirm that the Shang kings of legend were real, but they show only one side of their world, the ritual, not the intellectual or literary. The voices of their poets, their historians, their storytellers are gone. The Shang's disappearance left later Chinese history to be told by their conquerors, the Zhou, who justified their rule by declaring that the Shang had lost the mandate of heaven. The pattern repeats through history. Civilizations lose their own voices, leaving their stories to be told by others. Palmyra, rising centuries later in the Syrian desert, is another haunting example. Built at the crossroads of empires, Palmyra grew rich on caravan trade between Rome and Persia. Goods from India and Arabia passed through its markets. Its merchants became legends of wealth. In its prime, Palmyra was a vision of splendor, a grand colonnaded street, temples to gods from many cultures, tomb towers rising like sentinels over the desert. In the 3rd century AD, its queen Zenobia challenged Rome itself. Brilliant and ambitious, she expanded Palmyra's power across the Near East, even seizing Egypt. For a moment, her empire rivaled Rome's. Coins bore her image. Inscriptions proclaimed her authority. Rome struck back. Emperor Aurelian marched east, captured Zenobia, and crushed her city. The Romans wrote the story that survived. Zenobia, the rebel queen, brave but doomed. Palmyra's own version is gone. Its archives, its local chronicles, its voices perished with its fall. Today its ruins stand silent in the Syrian desert, stone columns catching the sun where libraries once stood. The city that once linked worlds now survives only in fragments of foreign memory, a reminder of how easily history can lose the voices of those who lived it. If any records of Palmyra's history survived, they were likely destroyed when Aurelian razed the city. Yet the ruins and inscriptions that remain still tell fragments of its story. Family tombs preserve names drawn from Greek, Semitic, and Arab traditions, a reflection of the city's cosmopolitan nature. Religious dedications reveal a pantheon as diverse as its people. Roman, Mesopotamian, and local gods worship together in the same temples. The architecture blends worlds, Roman-style theaters and colonnades built with Near Eastern flourishes. Palmyra's art, especially its funerary reliefs, shows merchants and nobles in hybrid dress, Persian robes, Roman jewelry, symbols of a culture that stood at the crossroads of empire. Zenobia herself added layers to this image. She claimed descent from Cleopatra, placing herself in a lineage of Eastern queens who had defied Rome. Inscriptions mention city councils and magistrates, suggesting that Palmyra balanced monarchy with civic institutions. Merchants from the city left inscriptions as far away as India, proof of an astonishing commercial reach. Before the modern destruction of the site, travelers could still walk its colonnaded avenue, pass under the Arch of Triumph, and enter the Temple of Bel, once one of the most magnificent sanctuaries in the ancient world. The ruins contrasted beauty and silence, the echo of a city that had once pulsed with wealth and ambition. Palmyra's end raises an unsettling question. Was its destruction simple punishment for rebellion, or a deliberate attempt to erase a culture that had grown too powerful and self-assured for Rome's comfort? Without Palmyra's own accounts, we cannot know whether its people viewed their defeat as betrayal, martyrdom, or mere survival. Like the Shang dynasty of China, Palmyra left grand monuments but lost its voice. Its story survives only through the eyes of its conquerors. In the Americas, the Maya faced a different fate. They left their own written language and painted murals, but much of it remains unread or buried. One striking example lies at Lamanai in Belize, among the temples that rise above the jungle. Among them stands a structure known as the Temple of the Jaguar, whose walls once glowed with painted scenes and glyphs that we can only partly decipher. Lamanai was exceptional among Maya cities. While many centers of the lowlands collapsed around the 9th century AD, Lamanai endured for more than 3,000 years, from early farming villages around 1500 BC through the height of the classic period between 250 and 900 AD, and even into colonial times. Its name, meaning submerged crocodile, fits its setting beside the New River Lagoon, a hub for trade that linked inland towns with the Caribbean. By the time the Temple of the Jaguar was built around 600 AD, the city thrived within a network of independent but interconnected Maya kingdoms bound by trade, religion, and rivalry. The temple's jaguar imagery was deliberate. In Maya belief, the jaguar symbolized power, night, and the underworld. Kings took on its attributes to show mastery over both life and death. The temple's murals once showed these ideas in vivid color, reds, blacks, and yellows, depicting rulers, gods, and rituals. Weather and time have stripped most of the detail away, but enough remains to glimpse scenes of ceremony and the ritual ball game, a cosmic contest between life and death drawn from Maya myth. The glyphs that accompany the paintings form part of one of the world's most sophisticated writing systems, but even now, scholars can read only about 4/5 of it. Some signs translate clearly, titles, dates, offerings, while others remain a mystery, silent marks whose meanings are lost. Excavating these murals poses challenges. Paint that has survived for centuries underground can disintegrate when exposed to light and air, so archaeologists often leave sections buried until conservation techniques improve. The Temple of the Jaguar still hides unknown murals and inscriptions beneath its soil and plaster. Daily life at Lamanai around 600 AD combined agriculture, trade, and ritual. Farmers grew maize, beans, and squash. Artisans shaped jade and obsidian. Traders ferried goods along the river. Elites performed ceremonies involving incense, music, and bloodletting to renew cosmic order. The temple stood at the center of this world, a sacred site and a monument to political power. The jaguar murals tied rulers to divine cycles, just as kings elsewhere used writing and architecture to anchor their authority. Compared to other Maya murals, those at Lamanai fit into a broader tradition. The walls of Bonampak in Chiapas show detailed battle scenes, musicians, and captives. The murals of San Bartolo in Guatemala depict gods and myths centuries older than the classic period. Lamanai's paintings share the same combination of dynastic imagery and cosmology, yet each site remains rare. Most Maya art survives in carved stone rather than pigment, making every fragment of color an irreplaceable record. The city's endurance makes it unique. While other Maya centers declined, Lamanai adapted. Trade routes shifted, temples were rebuilt, and the city lived on into the colonial era when Spanish missionaries erected a church atop the old sacred precinct. Beneath the Christian altar lay the bones of jaguars from ancient offerings, remnants of rituals that had once honored gods now forgotten. Even with what we know, vast gaps remain. The murals mention lords and offerings, but do not tell us the full story, whether they record victories, rituals, or myths. Archaeologists can only guess. In drawings of the glyph panels, some signs have neat translations beside them, while others are left blank. It's a visual metaphor for the Maya themselves, a civilization both revealed and hidden, speaking across centuries in a language we can almost, but not entirely, understand. While the Maya left partial words, the Persians of antiquity left almost none of the countless records their empire must have generated. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC and expanded by Darius and Xerxes, governed tens of millions of people across Asia, Africa, and Europe. It relied on a bureaucracy so advanced that later empires copied it. Yet the paperwork that sustained this vast machine, letters, orders, tax ledgers, census rolls, has almost entirely vanished. The Persians divided their empire into satrapies, provinces governed by satraps responsible for collecting tribute and enforcing royal decrees. Inspectors known as the king's eyes and ears traveled secretly to report corruption. It was a system that required meticulous record-keeping. The Persepolis fortification and treasury tablets, discovered in the 1930s, offer a rare glimpse of how it worked. These clay records, written in Elamite and other languages, list rations of food and drink for workers, payments for artisans, and supplies for temple rituals. They reveal an empire that counted every sheep, jar of wine, and loaf of bread, all administered with precision. The royal inscriptions carved in stone, like Darius's great Behistun inscription, tell another story, the official propaganda of conquest and divine order. Written in 3 languages, They later helped decipher cuneiform, but they reveal little of everyday governance. Between these bureaucratic tablets and the monumental inscriptions lies an immense gap. The correspondence between satraps and kings, the annual accounts, the local archives that kept the empire running, all are gone. Some may have been written on papyrus or parchment that decayed. Others destroyed when Alexander the Great burned Persian cities during his conquest. Greek historians described archives and libraries that no longer exist. What fragments we have still suggest a humane and complex bureaucracy. Women listed as administrators, families recorded by name, offerings for local gods alongside imperial cults. The postal system described by Herodotus, couriers riding in relays along the royal road, implies an ocean of lost documents that once flowed between capitals like Susa and Persepolis. If even a small portion of those archives survived, they could transform our understanding of ancient administration, how taxes were collected, how rebellions were detected, how cultural diversity was managed. Instead, we reconstruct the empire from what the fires spared, a few thousand tablets and stone proclamations. They show a world run by logic and discipline, yet most of its voice has been burned away. That sense of a missing chronicle returns with Troy. The most famous war of the ancient world lives on in Homer's Iliad. But if there were ever written records of the actual conflict, they are gone. Tradition places the Trojan War around 1200 BC at the twilight of the Bronze Age, when the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean were collapsing. Archaeological and textual fragments suggest that a city called Wilusa, almost certainly Troy, did exist, and that it lay at the center of political tensions between the Hittites and the Mycenaean Greeks. The Hittite archives mention this city and its western allies, the Ahhiyawa, but never describe the grand siege of legend at Hisarlik. In northwestern Turkey, excavations have revealed multiple layers of settlement, from early Bronze Age villages to cities with massive fortifications. One layer, Troy 7, was destroyed around 1180 BC, showing signs of fire, arrowheads, and sudden destruction. It fits the period that Homer's poem remembers. Mycenaean pottery at the site proves contact with Greece, and the scale of the ruins suggests a prosperous trading hub. If any written accounts once existed, they may have perished when the city burned, or during the wider Bronze Age collapse. Without those records, the Trojan War straddles the line between memory and myth. Homer's poetry may preserve fragments of real events, wars for trade routes, migrations, or political rivalries, but it cannot replace a lost chronicle. Between the arrowheads in the soil and the verses, sung centuries later, lies the silence of everything that was never written down. Even entire landscapes can lose their histories. The Sahara, now one of the world's harshest deserts, was once green and alive. Between 9000 and 3000 BC, monsoon rains turned its vast expanse into grassland filled with rivers, lakes, and wildlife. Rock art across the region shows people herding cattle, fishing, and dancing among giraffes and elephants. Places like Tassili Najjar in Algeria and the Akakus. Mountains in Libya are covered in thousands of paintings and carvings, scenes of a world now buried beneath sand. As the climate dried after 3000 BC, lakes vanished and grasslands turned to dunes. The people of the Green Sahara migrated, some eastward to the Nile, where their skills may have helped shape early Egyptian civilization, others southward into sub-Saharan Africa. Fossil bones of hippos and crocodiles, pollen traces from ancient lakes, and satellite images of buried riverbeds all confirm that the desert was once fertile. But its cultures disappeared as the rains failed. Occasional excavations uncover glimpses of their lives. Stone villages, cattle burials, ornaments made from distant shells. Even a grave in Niger, where a woman and 2 children were found holding hands beneath lake sediment. These discoveries hint at rich traditions and complex societies erased by desertification. The Sahara's transformation scattered its people and silenced their history. Seen together, these stories, From Palmyra's lost archives to the hidden murals of Lamanai, the vanished paperwork of Persia, the unwritten chronicles of Troy, and the forgotten civilizations beneath the sands show a recurring truth. History depends on what survives, and survival is often a matter of chance. A fire, a conquest, a shift in climate, and an entire world's voice can vanish, leaving only the stones to speak for it. The scale of what was lost is almost impossible to measure. Standing in Tassili Naja, surrounded by cliffs covered in ancient paintings of animals and rituals, it's hard to imagine that the people who made them once lived in green savannas rather than endless desert. You can picture the shores of what was once Mega Lake Chad, where fishermen cast their nets into clear water that has long since turned to dust. These are not isolated puzzles, but fragments of entire civilizations erased by millennia of climate change. The Sahara, now barren and scorching, was once fertile and full of life, dotted with rivers, lakes, and settlements. Rock art, stone dwellings, and ancient burials reveal societies that thrived for thousands of years before the desert swallowed their world. The question that lingers is how many of these lost cultures there were, and how much of their history still lies buried beneath dunes too vast to uncover. The Sahara's hidden rivers and forgotten cities remind us that even the harshest landscapes once held flourishing worlds. In another desert, far to the east, traces of human brilliance survive. In the carved cliffs of Petra, the city is famous for its monumental facades, the treasury with its sculpted columns and ornate detail, but its true genius lies in something less visible. Petra's survival depended not just on art, but on engineering. By the 1st century AD, it had become the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, a wealthy hub of the caravan trade linking Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. Caravans laden with spices, silk, and incense passed through its canyons, enriching its rulers. Visitors described shaded courtyards, gardens, and fountains, luxuries that seem impossible in such a dry land. The secret was water. The Nabateans built an extraordinary hydraulic system that caught every drop of rain. Channels carved into cliff faces guided runoff into cisterns and reservoirs. Ceramic pipes ran beneath the streets, and aqueducts brought water from distant springs. Many of these systems were cleverly concealed, covered to reduce evaporation, and fitted with basins to trap silt. This allowed Petra not just to endure, but to thrive, supporting tens of thousands of people, irrigating crops, and even feeding ornamental fountains. Archaeologists have traced hundreds of these structures, some still functioning today, proving how advanced Nabatean engineering really was. From the air, drone surveys reveal a hidden network of channels, dams, and terraces that transform the barren landscape into a masterpiece of design. Petra's decline was slow, but inevitable. By the 3rd century AD, sea trade across the Red Sea began to replace overland caravan routes, draining the city's wealth. Earthquakes damaged its aqueducts and temples, and without the means to repair them, Petra gradually emptied. By the early Islamic period, only a small settlement remained among the ruins. Yet even in ruin, its water system still tells the story of a people who mastered one of the harshest environments on Earth. Some channels are barely 20 centimeters wide, cut with such precision that they vanish into the rock unless caught by the light. Cisterns lined with ancient plaster still bear the fingerprints of workers who sealed them 2,000 years ago. Every part of the system was built with care, with backups in case of blockage, and rituals to maintain the flow. Water was not only survival, it was sacred power. To control it was to control the city itself. Reconstructing this network has taken decades of study. Archaeologists combine aerial mapping, excavation, and digital modeling to follow the lines of channels that often disappear into cliffs. Some remain hidden beneath landslides or layers of sediment, waiting to be rediscovered. Each new survey reveals more complexity. A dam here, a new branch of aqueduct there, showing that Petra's water system was even larger and more sophisticated than once thought. It's possible that much of it is still buried, waiting for future technology to reveal its full extent. For all its grandeur, Petra is a reminder that survival in extreme conditions depends on ingenuity as much as on wealth or conquest. The Nabateans lacked the vast armies of Rome or the bureaucracy of Persia, yet they created a city of stone and water that defied its desert home. In India, centuries later, a similar paradox unfolded. The Gupta Empire, which flourished between the 4th and 6th centuries AD, is remembered as a golden age of art, science, and mathematics. This was the era when the concept of zero was formalized, when astronomers described the Earth's rotation, and when poets like Kalidasa wrote masterpieces of Sanskrit literature. Yet despite all this brilliance, almost none of the Guptas' official records survive. Palm leaf manuscripts and birch bark documents have long decayed in India's humid climate, leaving only inscriptions, coins, and a few texts that escape destruction. The Gupta rulers, Chandragupta Shi, Samudragupta and Chandragupta Son, presided over peace, prosperity, and cultural flowering. Their mathematicians laid the foundations of the decimal system, while astronomers like Aryabhata calculated pi and described the movement of planets. Artists filled the Ajanta caves with murals of courtly life and Buddhist legends, using shading techniques that would not appear in Europe for 1,000 years. Sculptors refined the image of the Buddha into serene perfection, and poets explored love, nature, and philosophy with unmatched elegance. Yet the bureaucracy that must have supported such an empire has vanished. The Guptas surely kept records, tax accounts, royal edicts, medical treatises, but time and invasion erased them. What remains are fragments, Aryabhata's surviving treatise, a handful of poems, coins bearing divine imagery, and inscriptions carved into stone pillars praising the king's conquests. These fragments reveal much, yet conceal more. We see the art, but not the artists, the science, but not the institutions that nurtured it. The Ajanta murals survive, but the names of their painters are lost. The Allahabad pillar inscription praises Samudragupta's campaigns, but it reads more like poetry than history. The result is a golden age half-remembered, brilliant in its achievements, mysterious in its workings. Archaeology adds a few more pieces: planned cities, temple foundations, drainage systems, and terracotta figurines that bring daily life into focus. But the archives, libraries, and chronicles that could have shown us the minds behind the art are gone. The Guptas remind us that even at civilization's height, memory can be fragile. Across the world and several centuries earlier, the Moche civilization of northern Peru faced the same silence from another direction. They never wrote at all, yet their art speaks volumes. Between 100 and 700 AD, the Moche built monumental pyramids from millions of mud bricks along one of the driest coastlines on Earth. They engineered irrigation canals to turn the desert green, creating a chain of fertile valleys that sustained thriving cities. Their pottery is among the most vivid ever made, painted vessels that depict battles, ceremonies, gods, and even moments of everyday life in astonishing detail. Some show rulers seated on platforms receiving tribute. Others portray sacrifices, fishermen or healers at work. These ceramics are their history, painted in clay instead of written in ink. Their metalwork is equally stunning. Gold and copper ornaments, elaborate nose rings, and headdresses show mastery of techniques like gilding and soldering, long before such skills appeared elsewhere in the Americas. The discovery of royal tombs, especially the Lord of Sipan in 1987, revealed the full splendor of their world, rulers buried with warriors, attendants, and treasure fit for kings. But around 700 AD, the Moche civilization collapsed. Evidence points to massive El Niño floods, followed by droughts that destroyed their irrigation systems. The climate crisis was compounded by political fragmentation and internal conflict. Temples bear murals of sacrifice and scenes that may reflect desperation as the environment turned against them. Without writing, their story must be pieced together from ruins, bones, and painted vessels. The Moche left behind some of the most detailed visual records of any ancient society, yet without words to interpret them, much remains speculation. Were the sacrifices acts of faith, myth, or state control? Were the rulers gods or mortals elevated by ceremony? The pottery shows the scenes, but not the answers. The contrast between their artistic sophistication and their disappearance is haunting. A civilization that mastered both art and environment, undone by forces it could not control. Centuries later and half a world away, the Silla kingdom in Korea left treasures as enigmatic as the Moches. Between the 4th and 7th centuries AD, Silla rulers were buried in great mounds filled with gold, jade, and imported luxuries. Among these artifacts are the gold crowns of Gyeongju, masterpieces of craftsmanship and mystery. Made from thin sheets of hammered gold, they rise in branching tree-like forms, adorned with dangling pendants and comma-shaped jade beads called gogok. Too delicate to be worn in life, they were likely ceremonial objects symbolizing both earthly and spiritual power. Some scholars see them as representations of the world tree, a shamanic symbol connecting heaven and earth. Others view them as emblems of royal divinity or cosmic order. The crowns hint at a belief system that blended shamanism, ancestor worship, and emerging state ideology. Their antler-like motifs recall Siberian and steppe traditions, while their fine metalwork shows connections to broader Silk Road craftsmanship. The presence of crowns in women's tombs suggests that power in Silla may not have been limited to men. Queens and priestesses might have shared in the ritual authority of kings. These treasures, found alongside Roman glass, Persian silver, and Central Asian horse gear, show how deeply Silla was tied into global exchange networks even before unifying the Korean peninsula. What remains unknown is their full meaning. No written records from Silla's early centuries survive to explain the crown's symbolism or the ceremonies they adorned. They gleam in museums as silent witnesses to a vanished cosmology, a blend of art, religion, and politics now impossible to reconstruct. Like Petra's water channels or the Moche's pottery, they are reminders of how beauty can endure even when the words that once explained it are lost. Each artifact, each ruin, each buried network of canals and tombs is a fragment of memory. Together, they tell a single truth. Civilizations rise, create wonders, and fall, leaving only traces that hint at the brilliance that once was. The exact meaning remains uncertain. The Silla gold crowns remind us that even in a civilization rich in art, architecture, and far-reaching trade, the core beliefs behind its splendor can remain out of reach. Were these crowns simply royal ornaments, or symbols of a worldview where rulers served as both sovereigns and shamans, mediators between the earthly and the divine? The truth lies somewhere between metal and myth, and the silence of lost records leaves only speculation. History often vanishes through accident, fire, conquest, or decay, but sometimes the erasure is intentional. That was the fate of Admiral Zheng He, the Ming commander who once led the largest fleet the world had ever seen. His voyages, stretching from Southeast Asia to the eastern coast of Africa, were among the most ambitious enterprises in maritime history. Yet within a century of his death, much of the official record was deliberately destroyed. His treasure ships, his maps, and his reports were reduced to fragments, leaving historians to wonder what the Ming court wanted buried and why. Zheng He was born Ma He in Yunnan around 1371. Captured during the Ming conquest of the region, he was castrated and sent to serve in the imperial household. Intelligent and loyal, he rose rapidly under the Yongle Emperor, who sought to project China's power across the seas. In 1405, Zheng He was appointed to lead the first of 7 massive expeditions that would sail between 1405 and 1433. Contemporary accounts describe a fleet of more than 300 ships, some so-called treasure ships measuring nearly 400 feet in length, vessels 4 times the size of Columbus's flagship, which would not sail for another century. The fleet carried more than 27,000 men, including sailors, soldiers, interpreters, and scholars. The voyages took them across the South China Sea, through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, and as far as the Swahili coast of Africa. Ports of call included Champa in present-day Vietnam, Java, Sumatra, Ceylon, Calicut, Hormuz, Mogadishu, and Malindi. The missions were diplomatic rather than colonial, demonstrations of wealth and prestige. The fleets carried silks, porcelain, and gold to gift foreign rulers, returning with exotic goods such as spices, ivory, pearls, and even giraffes, which the Ming court interpreted as auspicious creatures called qilin. Zheng He established trade networks, brokered alliances, and inscribed his presence in stone. In Sri Lanka, a trilingual stele in Chinese, Tamil, and Persian still records his offerings to local deities. His fleet's presence reshaped Indian Ocean trade and cemented China's position as the dominant power of its age. Yet within decades of his death, the empire that had sent him out turned inward. The costly expeditions were deemed unnecessary and even harmful by later officials who favored isolation and agrarian conservatism. By the mid-15th century, the shipyards of Nanjing were silent, and the Great Wall was once again the focus of imperial investment. Worse, much of Zheng Hu's documentation, his logs, maps, and cargo records, was intentionally destroyed. Official histories reduced his exploits to brief mentions. The Ming Shilu, the empire's vast chronicle, alludes to the voyages but offers few details. Many historians believe Confucian bureaucrats who distrusted eunuchs like Zheng He and disapproved of maritime extravagance orchestrated the erasure. To preserve a vision of China as self-sufficient and morally upright, they chose to forget the age of the treasure fleets. The fragments that survived are tantalizing. Inscriptions in Sri Lanka and accounts from ports such as Calicut attest to the fleet's visits. Some maps attributed to the Ming period, though controversial, suggest an astonishing knowledge of distant seas. Descriptions of the treasure ships claim they had multiple decks, freshwater tanks, and compartments for livestock and gardens. Their scale dwarfed anything built in Europe until the modern era, when Columbus set sail with 3 small ships and fewer than 100 men. He was following in the wake of voyages an order of magnitude greater. The destruction of Zheng He's records has fueled centuries of speculation. Some fringe theories claim he reached the Americas long before Columbus, claims unsupported but not entirely dismissible given how much documentation has vanished. More grounded scholarship suggests the fleet reached far down the African coast, possibly to Mozambique. Without the missing logs, the full scope of his exploration remains unknown. The suppression of his legacy also reveals the politics of memory. Eunuchs like Zheng He had immense influence under the Yongle emperor, but after his death, the Confucian bureaucracy sought to restore ideological control. Overseas expansion was seen as wasteful and morally suspect. Forgetting Zheng He meant affirming a China turned inward, content to guard its frontiers rather than sail beyond them. It's easy to visualize the loss. Picture a towering treasure ship beside Columbus's Santa Maria, one a floating fortress of timber, the other a fragile speck by comparison. Imagine a map of the Indian Ocean glowing with routes connecting ports from Arabia to Africa, then a Ming archivist feeding those same maps into a fire, erasing decades of global reach in a single night. Yet fragments of his memory endured outside China, in oral traditions of East Africa, in ceramics unearthed along the coasts, and in stories of a great Chinese admiral who came with gifts, not armies. What discoveries lay in those missing logs? Did they describe lands unknown to Europe, scientific exchanges now lost, or evidence of China's contact with far-off cultures? The truth may still lie hidden in forgotten archives, but the deliberate silence of the Ming leaves us only speculation, and from the decks of Zheng, his vanished fleet, history shifts to the libraries of those who followed him, Jesuit missionaries who, centuries later, tried to bridge China and the West through knowledge rather than sails. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Jesuits entered China, determined not just to convert, but to understand. They documented everything they saw, its politics, science, customs, and philosophies, only for much of that record to vanish as well. The mission began in 1582, when Matteo Ricci arrived in Macau. Instead of preaching from pulpits, he dressed as a Confucian scholar, learned Chinese, and used mathematics and astronomy to win respect. His 1602 world map placed China at the center of the globe, a gesture of cultural diplomacy that fascinated both East and West. Over the next 2 centuries, Jesuits became advisors at court, teaching European science while translating Chinese philosophy into Latin. Their letters and treatises described daily life in astonishing detail: how officials sat exams, how families honored ancestors, how emperors governed from within the Forbidden City. These writings shaped Europe's image of China during the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Voltaire and Leibniz hailed it as a model of reason and virtue, a civilization ruled by ethics rather than superstition. Yet most of the missionaries' manuscripts are now lost. Political shifts and religious controversy ended their work. When the papacy condemned Confucian rites in the early 18th century, the Qing emperors banned Christian practice, confiscated Jesuit writings, and expelled many priests. Some texts were burned, others shipped to Europe and forgotten in archives. A few survive: Ricci's journals, Ferdinand Verbiest's reports on astronomy, and scattered letters describing eclipses, instruments, and imperial ceremonies. They reveal how the Jesuits observed China with precision and respect, often describing details that Chinese chroniclers ignored. Their influence rippled across continents, changing European geography, inspiring Enlightenment thought, and reshaping how the world imagined civilization itself. But the bulk of their observations, the dialect studies, medical comparisons, provincial maps, remain missing. Somewhere in libraries and locked repositories may still lie entire volumes of untranscribed insight, the Jesuits' lost record of early modern China. Not all histories vanish in archives. Some are swallowed whole by the land. For centuries, the Amazon was thought to be a wilderness incapable of sustaining complex societies. Yet evidence now shows that it once supported millions, living in engineered landscapes that turned forest into farmland. Artificial black soil, geometric earthworks, and LiDAR scans revealing ancient roads and cities have overturned the old myth of the green desert. The forest, it seems, was shaped by human hands. Epidemics brought by Europeans erased those civilizations long before explorers saw them, leaving only the jungle to reclaim their cities. A similar story unfolded in Cambodia, where the Khmer Empire built Angkor, a city of 1 million people sustained by one of the largest water systems ever constructed. Reservoirs and canals spread for miles, harnessing the monsoon to feed crops and temples. But climate change and political strain eventually broke the system. When droughts came, followed by catastrophic floods, the network failed. The very engineering that had made Angkor great became its undoing. LiDAR surveys now reveal the full scale of what was lost: neighborhoods, roads, reservoirs the size of lakes. Inscriptions show frantic repairs as canals cracked and embankments collapsed. As water turned from ally to enemy, people abandoned the city, moving south to safer lands. By the time European explorers found it centuries later, Angkor was a forest of stone and vines, a monument to both brilliance and fragility. From the deserts of Arabia to the jungles of Cambodia, from treasure ships to buried cities, the story repeats. Civilizations rise on ingenuity, but memory depends on survival, of paper, of stone, of will. The crowns of Silla, the maps of Zheng He, the manuscripts of the Jesuits, the canals of Angkor, all testify to how easily knowledge can vanish, leaving behind only fragments and questions. History's greatest mystery is not what we have discovered, but what has been lost, erased, or forgotten. How could a civilization that mastered water let it become the very force that destroyed them? Cambodia's story is written in stone and canals, but Arabia's earlier history is far harder to trace. Here the challenge isn't overgrown ruins or shattered temples, it's centuries of neglect and deliberate erasure. Before Islam, Arabia was home to powerful kingdoms, monumental temples and inscriptions carved into cliffs and valleys. For a long time, this deep past was ignored, dismissed as merely a prelude to the Islamic era. Only in recent decades have archaeologists begun to uncover the stories of Arabia's forgotten rulers, revealing a history far richer and more complex than once imagined. Between 500 BC and 600 AD, Arabia was not the cultural void it was often portrayed as. It was a mosaic of kingdoms and tribes, some small and local, others wealthy and influential enough to shape world politics. In the north were the Nabateans, whose capital at Petra controlled trade routes from the Red Sea into the Levant. They carved monumental facades into rose-colored cliffs and left inscriptions in their distinctive script. In the south, the Himyarite kingdom of modern Yemen grew prosperous from maritime trade and the incense caravans that crossed the desert. To the northwest, the Lihyanites ruled from Dedan, building fortresses and temples that matched the grandeur of their northern neighbors. Each kingdom rose and fell long before Islam, shaping the cultural and political landscape of the peninsula in ways we're only now beginning to grasp. Across the desert, the evidence of these lost societies remains scattered but abundant. Thousands of inscriptions in Old South Arabian, Safaitic, Thamudic, and other scripts are etched into cliffs across Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Yemen. Some are prayers to forgotten gods, others record royal dedications or boundary markers. Excavations in Alula have revealed monumental tombs with facades resembling those of Petra, hinting at a shared cultural sphere. In Yemen, temples dedicated to deities such as Al-Makka and Athtar show that Arabia's religious life was elaborate and deeply rooted. Fortified caravan stations dotting the trade routes reveal a level of organization that defies the old image of Arabia as purely tribal and nomadic. Yet much of this past remains a mystery. The rise of Islam in the 7th century changed not only Arabia's faith, but its historical memory. Early Muslim chroniclers referred to the preceding era as Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, a term that emphasized moral and spiritual transformation rather than the achievements of pre-Islamic civilization. Pagan temples were left to decay, inscriptions were ignored or destroyed, and oral traditions about ancient kings faded away. When Islamic historians later wrote of earlier Arabia, they focused on genealogies tied to the Prophet's lineage, leaving little record of independent kingdoms like Himyar or Lihyan. The incense trade reveals just how central Arabia once was to the ancient world. Frankincense and myrrh from the southern highlands were prized across empires, burned in Roman temples, Jewish rituals, and Christian ceremonies. Caravans carried these resins north through a chain of oases and forts, enriching the kingdoms that controlled the routes. Roman writers complained that vast amounts of gold flowed eastward in exchange for Arabian aromatics. Archaeological remains of wells, storage depots, and fortified stops confirm how lucrative and organized this trade was. Arabia also supplied horses, textiles, and crops, linking it tightly to the economies of Rome, Persia, and India. Traces of this forgotten history appear everywhere. Inscriptions at Tamar, a northern oasis, mention kings who dealt directly with empires to the north. Roman sources record that the Nabatean king Aretas IV once ruled territory stretching from Damascus to the Red Sea. In Yemen, the Himyarites allied at times with both Persia and Aksum, drawing Arabia into the conflicts of the wider Near East. Byzantine records describe Arab tribes serving as federati, client allies fighting in Rome's wars. Combined with the inscriptions scattered through the desert, these accounts show Arabia as a vibrant and interconnected region, not a forgotten wilderness. Even so, much remains untranslated. Tens of thousands of rock inscriptions have been photographed but never fully studied. Sophitic graffiti, short carvings by nomads across the basalt deserts of Syria, Jordan, and northern Saudi Arabia offer glimpses into daily life. Prayers and migrations, yet their sheer number has overwhelmed researchers. Entire dynasties are mentioned only in a handful of old South Arabian texts. Names and lineages that could redefine the political map of pre-Islamic Arabia if properly understood. Imagine a cliff face covered in these inscriptions, pleas to gods whose names no one can pronounce. Records of alliances and wars weathered by centuries of sand. Then picture nearby stones carved centuries later with Quranic verses, the older scripts fading beneath the newer faith. Or envision the incense caravans that once crossed the peninsula, long lines of camels moving north under the sun, guarded by Himyarite soldiers from their fortress outposts, their routes stretching all the way to Roman Syria. This is the Arabia that existed before Islam, a land of kingdoms, merchants and monumental art connected to the wider world by trade and diplomacy. Its disappearance from memory wasn't the result of obscurity but of erasure and neglect. The questions linger like inscriptions half buried in sand. What myths were told in the temples of Al-Makkah? What dynasties ruled and fell before history turned its gaze elsewhere? How many names of forgotten kings lie carved in scripts still waiting to be translated? Arabia before Islam was not an empty desert, but a crossroads of cultures and ideas. Its story, once overshadowed, is only now beginning to re-emerge from the silence of the dunes. Nazareth sits at the center, with paths stretching south to Egypt, east toward Mesopotamia and India, north into Asia Minor, and west across the Mediterranean into Europe. Along these ancient routes, people, goods, and ideas moved freely. Traders carried not just spices or textiles, but stories and philosophies. It isn't impossible that a young craftsman from Galilee could have joined a caravan, followed the roads, or sought new horizons. The question is whether he did, and if so, why the Gospels chose not to record it. Most historians are cautious. The evidence for distant travels is too thin to confirm. And while the legends that place Jesus in India or Britain are captivating, they rest on faith and folklore, not documentation. The more grounded view is the simplest, that he stayed in Galilee, working as a builder, living quietly until the beginning of his ministry. The Gospel writers, focused on his message and mission, may have seen his earlier years as irrelevant to the story they wanted to tell. What mattered was not the carpenter's life, but the teacher's words. And so the question, where was he during those missing years, remains one without a final answer, a silence preserved between the lines of Scripture. After examining the gap in one man's life, it's natural to look at how entire centuries can disappear from history. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, Europe entered an age where the written record nearly dried up. Historians still debate whether the Dark Ages is an unfair term, but what can't be denied is that between the 5th and 10th centuries, written material became scarce. Rome had been a civilization of record keepers, laws, taxes, speeches, and chronicles written meticulously. When that system crumbled, so did the habit of writing everything down. New rulers, the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in Gaul, the Lombards in the north, governed differently. Some issued laws, but few kept detailed annual histories. Literacy narrowed to monasteries, and even there chronicling was sporadic. The result is a patchwork. A few chronicles, such as those of Fredegar or the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, offer glimpses, but much of Europe's story from this period must be reconstructed through archaeology. Coins, jewelry, ship burials, and ruined cities tell what words do not. One of the greatest mysteries of this era is the Dust Veil event of 536 AD, when chroniclers wrote that the sun dimmed and crops failed. Tree rings confirm years of poor growth across the globe, suggesting a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in Iceland or Central America, that blanketed the atmosphere in ash. Famine and plague followed, yet the event is described in only a handful of lines. Imagine a disaster that changed the world, remembered only as a shadow in ancient notes. The migrations that reshaped Europe during these centuries are also poorly documented. We know the Slavs spread across the east. The Avars and Bulgars moved into the Balkans, and new kingdoms emerged. But not how these shifts happened, who fought whom, or how cultures blended. Archaeology again fills the silence through changing pottery styles, burial customs, and settlement patterns. The record is a collage of fragments rather than a continuous story. The absence of text invites speculation. The Sutton Hoo ship burial in England, discovered in 1939, revealed treasures, helmets, weapons, Byzantine silver that spoke of wealth and connection, yet no writing tells us who was buried there. In Scandinavia, Viking shipgraves whisper of powerful women and kings, but the sagas came centuries later. Some coins bear the names of rulers otherwise unknown, fleeting signatures of power. Even natural evidence, tree rings, ice cores, sometimes tells us more than the scribes did, showing years of drought or disease invisible in human archives. Such gaps make the imagination restless. In the 1990s, the phantom time hypothesis proposed that 300 years of medieval history were fabricated, meaning Charlemagne never existed. Archaeology quickly disproved it, but the idea's popularity revealed how uneasy we feel about missing time. When shelves of history fall empty, people start to wonder if those years ever truly happened. Despite the silence, the centuries after Rome were far from empty. Christianity spread across the continent. Monasteries preserved the works of antiquity. The roots of modern nations took hold in the kingdoms of the Carolingians, the Lombards, and the Anglo-Saxons. Life went on. People farmed, traded, built, and prayed, but fewer thought to record it. The problem wasn't that civilization had vanished. It was that its record keepers had. Visualize the timeline. Roman history rolls like a long scroll, dense with names and dates. After 476, the scroll frays and grows thin, whole pages missing. In their place are shards of pottery, ship graves, and the residue of volcanoes. These remnants speak, but not in sentences. The question is whether the Dark Ages were truly an age of collapse or simply an age of silence. Perhaps both. Civilization endured, but the memory of it dimmed. From this quiet stretch of Europe's past, we move further back, beyond writing, beyond kings, to a time when vast cities rose and fell without ever leaving a single word behind. On the plains of modern Ukraine and Moldova lie traces of the Cucuteni-Tripilia culture, a Neolithic civilization that built immense settlements between 5000 and 3000 BC. Seen from the air, they form giant spirals and concentric rings, rows of clay houses packed tightly together, sometimes 2 stories tall, surrounding wide central plazas. Some sites covered several square kilometers and may have housed tens of thousands of people, larger than the cities of Mesopotamia that came 1,000 years later, discovered in the 19th century and studied intensively since the 1970s. These mega-sites reveal a level of organization rarely associated with prehistoric Europe. The houses were standardized, each with ovens, hearths, and storage areas. Their pottery was beautifully decorated with swirling red, white, and black patterns, and clay figurines, mostly female, suggest a symbolic or religious life as rich as their architecture. Agriculture supported them, with vast fields of wheat and barley, and livestock herds maintained around the settlements. But around 3000 BC, the culture vanished. Many of their houses were burned deliberately, entire settlements left in ashes. Why burn your own city? Some believe it was ritual renewal, a cyclical act of destruction and rebuilding. Others point to soil exhaustion, climate change, or pressure from migrating steppe peoples. Whatever the cause, their cities never evolved into stone metropolises. They left no palaces, no temples, and no writing. Without kings or armies, they organized on a scale that defies explanation. Were they governed by councils, by shared custom, Their coordination hints at complex social bonds, yet we will never know their names or stories. Archaeology fills in the void, post holes marking homes, fragments of painted pottery, patterns of burned earth showing where walls once stood. Some scholars argue the population estimates are exaggerated, that the sites might have been seasonal gathering places rather than permanent cities. Even so, the scale of construction and planning is astonishing. At their height, these settlements may have been the largest in the world. By 3000 BC, they were gone, replaced by migrating cultures who left smaller, simpler settlements. Whether they collapsed from within or were absorbed by newcomers, their legacy faded before history began. If they had endured, our story of civilization's origins might place its cradle not in Mesopotamia, but on the plains of Eastern Europe. Their disappearance reminds us how fragile memory is. 1,000 years of urban life can vanish, leaving only soil patterns and shards of pottery to whisper what once was. From these vanished proto-cities, the story shifts south to the Nile, where Egypt's origins raise their own riddles. We often begin Egypt's history with Narmer, the first pharaoh, around 3100 BC, but evidence shows centuries of forgotten kings and evolving culture before him. The Badarian and Naqada periods laid the groundwork for pharaonic civilization, complete with agriculture, trade, and early symbols that prefigure hieroglyphs. Artifacts like the ivory tags from tomb Uj at Abydos suggest writing and kingship existed before Narmer's supposed unification. Figures such as the Scorpion Kings, half legendary, hint at rulers who came earlier, their names erased or folded into later propaganda. Egypt's emergence seems sudden only because so much was lost. Villages, experiments in leadership, and early temples all paved the way for the first dynasty, yet few traces remain. Later pharaohs rewrote their own past, simplifying centuries of development into a single origin myth. The result is that Egypt appears to rise fully formed, when in truth it was the culmination of generations of forgotten rulers and silent transitions. And across the ocean, another enigma lies carved into a single green stone. In Veracruz, Mexico, a slab known as the Cascajal block bears 62 mysterious symbols, arranged in lines, repeating patterns that suggest writing. Dated to around 900 BC, it predates the earliest Maya texts by centuries. The Olmec civilization, long credited as Mesoamerica's mother culture, may have been the first to invent a script, but if so, it vanished as completely as Egypt's pre-dynastic kings. No other example of this writing has ever been found. Whether the Cascajal block records a ritual, a list, or something else entirely, we cannot read it. Each of these mysteries, Jesus' silent years, Europe's missing centuries, the vanished cities of the Tripilia, the erased kings of Egypt, the unread tablet of the Olmec, reminds us that history is not a continuous story, but a fragile chain of fragments. Between those fragments lies the silence where imagination and discovery meet. The discovery of the Cascajal block remains both fascinating and frustrating. Because it was unearthed by road builders rather than during a controlled excavation, its exact archaeological context is uncertain. It was reportedly found alongside debris dated to the Olmec period, but without a clear site association, skeptics argue the dating is less secure. Some even suggest it may have been an isolated ritual object, never intended as part of a broader writing system. Yet the evidence for its authenticity is persuasive. The slab is made of serpentine, a stone the Olmec often used for ritual carvings. Its symbols resemble known Olmec motifs seen on pottery, figurines, and monuments, and their arrangement in neat rows seems too systematic to be mere decoration. If it were art alone, why such precise sequencing? The deliberate structure implies meaning, perhaps words, perhaps ritual order, but something beyond ornamentation. What deepens the mystery is that no later Mesoamerican scripts, not the Maya, Zapotec, Epi-Olmec, or Mixtec, resemble the symbols on the Cascajal block, It's possible the Olmec experimented with writing and abandoned it, or that their script evolved into something unrecognizable. Another possibility is that the Olmec had a full literary tradition, texts written on bark paper, cloth, or other perishable materials that simply decayed in the tropical climate long before the Spanish arrived. We know the Maya once had thousands of books, of which only 4 survive. If the Olmec ever had similar codices, they would have been even more vulnerable to time and humidity. The Cascajal block might be the lone survivor of an entire lost corpus. Visualizing the connection helps. Picture the block beside a page from a Maya codex. The Mayan glyphs are dense, curving, phonetic, each one representing syllables and words. The Cascajal symbols are simpler and more abstract, yet both are organized in deliberate rows, suggesting an early attempt to fix language in material form. Perhaps the block was a prototype, the first experiment in recording speech. Or perhaps it was part of a fully developed system that never spread beyond a small priestly circle. Scholars note recurring motifs, a maize symbol, unsurprising for a civilization that revered corn as sacred sustenance. An insect-like figure that may symbolize transformation or fertility, and a throne motif possibly linked to rulership or ceremony. Together, these elements could represent a ritual text, a record of offerings, a list of rulers, or a mythic sequence. But with only a single example, there is no way to test the theory. Decipherment requires comparison, a corpus of inscriptions, and ideally a bilingual reference like the Rosetta Stone. With just one slab, the odds of unlocking its meaning are slim. That leaves the Cascajal block as a haunting possibility, either the first page of America's earliest book or a solitary ceremonial relic. If it is writing, then somewhere in ancient Veracruz there may once have been archives, codices, or monuments carved in the same script, all long since vanished. The Olmec, who sculpted colossal stone heads that still stare across the jungles, may also have carved words, but their language has slipped beyond reach. The unanswered question lingers. If this was writing, where are the rest of the words, the books, the stories that should have followed? Were they never created, or were they erased by time and conquest? From the silence of a single carved stone, the story moves to the opposite extreme, to a city where writing once overflowed. Long before the Library of Alexandria, there was Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and a king who set out to collect all the knowledge of his world. Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 627 BC, presided over an empire stretching from Mesopotamia to Egypt. A conqueror by necessity, he was also a scholar by passion. In inscriptions, he boasted of reading and writing both Akkadian, the language of his empire, and Sumerian, the sacred tongue of antiquity. He was not content to rely on scribes. He wanted to be remembered as a king of wisdom. Ashurbanipal ordered scribes across his territories to gather and copy every kind of text they could find. Myths, hymns, legal codes, omens, rituals, astronomical charts, and letters. The result was staggering. Tens of thousands of clay tablets stored in his palace at Nineveh. Some estimates place the total at nearly 40,000. Making it the first great library in human history. Among them were works that would have been lost forever without his effort, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Mesopotamian tale of kingship, mortality, and the flood. Alongside it were creation myths, lists of gods, medical recipes, astrological records, and bilingual dictionaries that preserved the link between Sumerian and Akkadian thought. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, fire swept through the city. The palace burned, but the clay tablets, hardened by heat, survived. Centuries later, in the mid-19th century, British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard uncovered the ruins. His team unearthed thousands of tablet fragments, many broken and scattered. They were shipped to the British Museum, where scholars began the long process of piecing them together. In 1872, George Smith, a self-taught scholar, stunned the world when he deciphered a Mesopotamian flood story on one of the tablets, an older version of the biblical narrative. Suddenly, Ashurbanipal's library revealed a world far older and more complex than anyone had imagined. Even now, much of the library remains unstudied. Tens of thousands of fragments rest in museum storage, awaiting reconstruction. Modern imaging techniques and digital databases are helping scholars match pieces, but it is slow work. Some fragments likely hold unknown texts, lost epics, rituals, or scientific writings. Each new discovery offers the possibility of rewriting what we know about ancient Mesopotamia. Ashurbanipal himself claimed to have read and understood the tablets, presenting himself as both king and scholar. Whether that was true or political theatre, it reflected his desire to preserve knowledge. His collection included bilingual tablets, where ancient Sumerian passages were accompanied by Akkadian translations, effectively creating ancient study guides. The project made Nineveh not only a center of empire, but also of education. The library's appearance would have been less grand than Alexandria's marble halls, but no less profound. Rooms stacked with rows of clay tablets, each covered in the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script. Imagine a library where every book is broken, coded, and half unreadable. That is what modern scholars face. And yet these fragments, baked in fire and buried for 2,600 years, are what allowed Mesopotamia to speak again. The question now is what still lies unread among them. Could there be texts that alter our understanding of ancient history, of science, or of myth? The discovery of Gilgamesh was only one revelation. Perhaps others wait in those boxes of clay. Ashurbanipal's library is proof that knowledge, when written in the right medium, can outlast fire, empire, and time itself. But not all mysteries are about what survives. Some are about what was never there to begin with, places imagined into being, drawn onto maps, and believed for centuries before finally vanishing. Sailors once swore they saw it, a perfect, round island west of Ireland called High Brazil. It appeared on medieval maps, inspired expeditions, and lived in Irish legend as a paradise hidden by mists. Some said it was visible only once every 7 years. Others claimed it was home to wise beings or treasures beyond imagining. For centuries it drifted between myth and geography, drawn faithfully by cartographers who copied one another's maps. By the 1800s, as ships charted the Atlantic more accurately, the island disappeared from the charts. Whether it was a mirage, a misidentified coastline, or a story too powerful to let go, High Brazil endures as a symbol of how the human mind fills blank spaces with wonder, with hope, and with the promise that somewhere, just beyond the horizon, another mystery waits to be found. The persistence of the legend of the 10 lost tribes shows how deeply the idea resonated. Its disappearance shaped Jewish identity in profound ways. When the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians, only Judah remained intact, and from Judah the word Jew ultimately derives. The loss of the 10 northern tribes made Judah the surviving core of Jewish history, forcing its culture and religion to bear the weight of identity and continuity. The trauma of exile left an indelible mark on Jewish thought, giving rise to centuries of hope for restoration and reunion. Themes that echo in prophetic writings and later traditions. Visualize a map of ancient Israel before 722 BC, 12 tribal territories stretching from the Galilee to the Negev. Then picture arrows radiating outward from the northern lands, arrows pointing into Assyria, across Mesopotamia, and farther into Persia, each marking a vanished community. Beyond those arrows, the trail ends. That unfinished story, the dispersal without return, became a wound in history that inspired myth, longing, and endless speculation. The tale of the 10 lost tribes shows how an entire people can disappear from the written record, leaving behind only fragments and legend. But sometimes the reverse happens. A people long thought to be legend reemerges when their world is uncovered in the earth. That was the case with the Hittites. For centuries, they existed only in scattered biblical references mentioned among the foes of Israel. Many 19th century scholars doubted they had ever been real, assuming they were a minor tribe or a mistake of translation. Then in the early 20th century, archaeology proved otherwise. In 1906, German archaeologist Hugo Winkler began excavations at Boğazköy in central Turkey. What he found transformed history. The site turned out to be Hattusa, the capital of a vast Bronze Age empire. Its remains included walls, temples, palaces, and most strikingly, tens of thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform. Suddenly, the Hittites emerged from obscurity as one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age. The tablets revealed a literate bureaucracy, a complex pantheon of gods, and an empire that stretched across Anatolia and into northern Syria. Among the discoveries was the world's earliest known peace treaty, the agreement between Egypt and the Hittite king after the Battle of Kadesh around 1259 BC. The archive covered every aspect of life, royal decrees, legal codes, myths, rituals, and letters between kings. Religious texts described festivals and sacrifices in detail. Legal ones outlined property rights and punishments. Mythological cycles told stories that mirrored and perhaps inspired later Greek tales. One describes a storm god battling a serpent, an image that echoes through Indo-European myth from Zeus and Typhon to Thor and Jörmungandr. Other tablets contain diplomatic correspondence, including a remarkable letter from the Egyptian queen Ankhesenamun, widow of Tutankhamun, appealing to the Hittite king Shuppiluliuma I to send her a husband, an event that triggered political turmoil and even assassination. Even with such riches, much of the record is broken or unread. Many tablets are fragmentary, thousands still unstudied, their wedges pressed into clay more than 3,000 years ago. Fires that destroyed Hattusa during the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC baked the tablets hard, preserving them, but other archives across the empire were lost entirely. The result is uneven. We have treaties, rituals, and letters, but few narrative histories. Whether the Hittites avoided writing grand royal annals, or whether those records simply perished, is uncertain. Their influence reached far beyond their borders. The Hittites were early experimenters with iron, centuries before it became common. Though bronze remained the standard, their limited use of iron weapons and prestige items foreshadowed the coming Iron Age. The city itself was monumental, vast fortifications ringed with gates guarded by lions and sphinxes, temples to the storm god and sun goddess rising inside. In storerooms beneath the palaces lay shelves of tablets stacked like bricks, an ancient bureaucracy preserved in clay. Before their rediscovery, historians viewed the late Bronze Age as a world balanced between Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Hittite archives revealed a third pillar, an empire powerful enough to speak to the pharaohs as equals. Their letters show kings addressing one another as brother, trading daughters in marriage, negotiating alliances, and sharing goods and knowledge. The Hittites weren't a biblical footnote. They were a superpower. Still, mysteries persist. Why did their empire collapse so suddenly around 1200 BC, along with Mycenaean Greece, Ugarit, and much of the ancient Mediterranean world? Invasions, drought, internal conflict all played a role. The so-called Bronze Age collapse erased their cities, and for nearly 3,000 years their name vanished. Only with the rediscovery of Hattusa did they rise again. Today, archaeologists and linguists continue to piece their story together, matching fragments and translating signs. In museums, rows of broken tablets lie like a puzzle still unsolved. Each wedge, each partial word, might reveal another myth, another treaty, another clue about how the ancient world was connected. The rediscovery of the Hittites turned a forgotten people into a cornerstone of history, proving that civilizations can be lost for millennia and then resurrected from clay. And just as their archives illuminate a vanished age, they remind us how fragile records are. A fire can preserve a library or destroy it. What we know of the Hittites comes from the few rooms that survived. How much more of the Bronze Age still lies buried, unread, waiting for its next rediscovery? The Celts are a civilization we know mostly through other people's words. Their world is glimpsed through Roman reports, Greek commentaries, and later Christian retellings. Their own voices are gone. What they lost is hard to fathom. The myths that survive in medieval Irish and Welsh manuscripts, rich, intricate, and strange, were once part of a much wider oral tradition. They must have been told and retold across Europe in countless variations, but only those recorded centuries later by Christian monks remain, reshaped to fit new beliefs. Were they faithful echoes of Druidic lore, or reinventions crafted for medieval audiences? The question still lingers. The Celts' laws, which Julius Caesar said were memorized by Druids, survive only in faint outlines preserved in later Irish legal tracts. Their philosophies, by some Roman accounts as deep as those of Greece, disappeared completely. Their genealogies and histories, once recited aloud in ritual and assembly, were silenced when the oral tradition died. The Ogham inscriptions scattered across Ireland and Western Britain are among the few written traces left. They are spare and haunting, short names and boundary marks carved on standing stones, dating centuries after the Druids had vanished. They show that literacy existed, but only in a limited utilitarian form. Archaeology fills part of the silence. The Celts were master metalworkers. Artifacts like the Gundestrup cauldron found in Denmark are covered in scenes of gods, warriors, and animals. Myths locked in silver relief, their meanings now guessed at, but not known. Exquisite torques, shields, and helmets from sites such as Bibracht in Gaul and the Hill of Tara in Ireland speak of craftsmanship and ceremony. They reveal a culture of ritual and symbolism, not savagery. Yet without words to explain them, we can only imagine the stories those objects once illustrated. The contrast with their neighbors is striking. On one side, the Greeks and Romans left entire libraries, philosophy, history, and poetry, in volumes that still fill shelves. On the other, the Celtic world offers brilliance in metal, stone, and myth, but almost no texts to give it voice. The imbalance shaped how history remembers Europe. If the Celts had recorded their myths and ideas as the Greeks did, our sense of Western civilization might look very different. The loss matters because it erases a worldview. The Celts influenced Europe for centuries, trading, warring, and coexisting with classical empires. They had their own systems of thought, law, and faith, but we know them only through hostile observers or distant echoes. What philosophies did the Druids teach that alarmed the Romans? What sacred stories were told in the groves, never written down, that evolved into Arthurian legend and fairy lore? What visions of life, death, and the cosmos were lost when their spoken traditions vanished? The Celts left behind art, legend, and archaeology, but not their own words. Their silence stands in contrast to another ancient civilization that did preserve its voice, the Shang dynasty of China. The Shang ruled from around 1600 to 1046 BC, and from them we have the earliest Chinese writing. Yet even there, most of what once existed is gone. The Shang recorded their rituals and questions to the gods on oracle bones, animal shoulder blades, and turtle shells. The cracks made by fire were read as answers, and scribes carved the results alongside the questions. Thousands have been found, creating a record of harvests, wars, royal births, and sacrifices. Bronze vessels from the same era bear short inscriptions, dedications, and names that add to the picture of a literate, highly organized society. But these are fragments. A dynasty that ruled for centuries with bureaucracy, warfare, and religion must have produced far more writing than what survives. The Shang likely kept annals, genealogies, and hymns on bamboo slips or silk, materials too fragile to endure. When the Zhou conquered them, they imposed their own order and myth of legitimacy, the mandate of heaven, which cast the Shang as corrupt and doomed. Any surviving texts may have been destroyed or allowed to rot. The rediscovery of the oracle bones was accidental. For centuries, villagers near Anyang, the Shang capital, unearthed the inscribed shells and sold them to apothecaries as dragon bones to grind into medicine. Only in the late 19th century did scholars recognize the carvings as ancient script. What had nearly become powder revealed the origins of Chinese writing. The bones recorded everything from royal illnesses to weather omens, offering a vivid look into the mind of early China. Yet even with thousands of inscriptions, the picture is partial. The bones tell us what kings asked their ancestors, not how they thought, legislated, or created stories. Archaeological finds at Anyang show enormous royal tombs filled with bronzes, jades and chariots, evidence of wealth and power. If divination required scribes and records, administration surely did too. But those documents are gone. Their absence means the Shang story is told mostly by their conquerors. Later Chinese texts preserved the names of Shang kings, confirming their reality, but the Shang voice itself was silenced. Their civilization, the first to write in East Asia, became a ghost, known only through fragments of ritual. Palmyra in Syria offers another version of the same silence. It was a desert city that became a bridge between the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, thriving on trade. Its merchants carried silk and spices west and Roman goods east. In its golden age, its colonnaded avenues, temples, and theaters rivaled any in the empire. Its queen, Zenobia, ruled briefly over an empire of her own in the 3rd century AD, challenging Rome before being defeated and captured. But the story we know is Roman. Palmyra's own records, its chronicles, letters, and voices are lost, likely destroyed when Emperor Aurelian sacked the city. What remains are inscriptions in Greek and Palmyran Aramaic, tomb reliefs showing richly dressed families, and the grand architecture that still dominates the desert. They reveal a cosmopolitan world that mixed Eastern and Western traditions, gods of Babylon beside Jupiter, clothing blending Persian and Roman styles, and merchants whose reach extended as far as India. Yet we do not know how Palmyrans saw themselves, what they wrote about their queen, or how they understood their fall. The ruins speak only in stone. The Maya of Central America present the opposite problem. They left an abundance of writing, but much of it is still unread. At Lamanai in Belize, the Temple of the Jaguar once glowed with murals and glyphs describing rituals and rulers. The jaguar, a symbol of power and the underworld, dominates the imagery. Some inscriptions have been translated, names, dates, offerings, but many remain undeciphered or lost to time. The Maya script, one of the most complex in the world, is only partly understood. Erosion, destruction, and colonial suppression erased much of it. Beneath the soil, murals still wait to be uncovered. The Temple of the Jaguar stands as a vivid example of how writing can both preserve and hide the past. The Maya were literate, artistic, and scientific, yet much of their meaning is locked away until the remaining glyphs can be fully read. In contrast, Persia's empire under Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes must have generated mountains of records, reports, accounts, and decrees to manage a realm stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. Almost none survive. The few that do, such as the Persepolis fortification and treasury tablets, show a vast administrative machine tracking food, labor, and rations with precision. Royal inscriptions like Darius's Behistun text proclaim imperial glory, but everyday correspondence, letters between satraps, reports from inspectors, and archives of tribute has vanished. Papyrus, leather, and wax tablets have long since decayed or burned, especially when Alexander's armies torched Persian palaces. From the Celts' silence to the Shang's bones, from Palmyra's ruins to the Maya's undeciphered walls and Persia's vanished paperwork, the pattern repeats. Civilizations rise, write, and build, but their voices fade, leaving others to tell their stories. What survives, stone, clay, bronze, paint, is never the full picture. It is a whisper from a world that once spoke loudly, reminding us how easily memory can be lost, and how much of human history still waits to be heard. Herodotus once described the Persian couriers with admiration, writing that neither snow nor rain nor darkness of night could stop them from completing their appointed rounds, a phrase later borrowed by the modern U.S. Postal Service. That system must have generated mountains of paperwork, reports, letters, and orders passing constantly along the royal road. Yet not a single courier's dispatch has survived. It's one of the great frustrations of ancient history. If even a fraction of the satrapal archives had endured, we might know in detail how gold dust from India, grain from Egypt, and textiles from Babylon moved through the empire. We might trace the careers of provincial governors, the detection of rebellions, and the daily rhythm of administration in one of history's first great bureaucracies. Instead, we reconstruct it from scattered fragments. Imagine a map of Persia shaded by satrapy, Lydia, Egypt, Babylonia, Bactria, Media, each governed by officials writing reports, clerks keeping accounts, scribes sealing tablets. The information flowed along the royal road to Persepolis or Susa, where archivists stored it for the king. Then imagine the entire archive consumed by fire, leaving only a few tablets hardened enough to endure. That is the scale of the loss. Even so, the surviving tablets offer glimpses of an empire that was both efficient and humane. They record rations distributed to men and women alike, sometimes listing their children by name. They mention offerings to local gods, showing a state that tolerated religious diversity. Each line of cuneiform represents a person, a duty, a life within the imperial system. The gaps are immense. Were the secrets of Persian administration destroyed in Alexander's conquests, or do caches of papyrus still lie buried beneath the sands? Every surviving scrap hints at a bureaucracy as sophisticated as that of later empires. But the living heart of it, the daily exchanges between satraps and the great king, remains missing, the disappearance of those. Records leads naturally to another absence, the lost. Chronicles of Troy, the Trojan War, the most famous conflict of the ancient world, survives not through archives but through poetry. Achilles and Hector, the wooden horse, and the fall of the city are etched into legend, yet the actual war, if it occurred, is barely documented. The supposed events belong to the twilight of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, when the Hittites, Egyptians, Mycenaeans, and Levantine cities were bound in a fragile web of diplomacy and trade. It was an era that produced letters and treaties in abundance, yet none mention a siege of Troy. The earliest literary sources, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, were composed centuries later, blending memory with myth. Contemporary evidence comes instead from Hittite archives that refer to a city called Wilusa, almost certainly Troy, and to conflicts involving a Western people known as the Ahiyawa, likely the Achaeans of Greek tradition. These texts prove that Western Anatolia was contested ground, but say nothing of a 10-year war or the heroes of epic. If written accounts ever existed, whether Greek or Trojan, they perished in the fires of the Bronze Age collapse. Archaeology at Hisarlik. The mound, identified as Troy, reveals a city repeatedly built and destroyed. Troy 7, dating to about 1180 BC, shows signs of violent destruction, walls toppled, arrowheads scattered, buildings burned. Mycenaean pottery attests to contact with Greece, while Hittite correspondence places the region within a network of rival powers. It is easy to imagine that one of these conflicts inspired the legend, but without contemporary chronicles, the historical core remains elusive. The gap between Homer's poetry and the archaeological layers is vast. If we had a single local archive, palace tablets listing supplies for the war, or dispatches describing the siege, it could turn myth into history. Perhaps such records once existed, written in the lost Linear B script of the Mycenaeans, or in a Trojan archive, now buried beyond reach. For now, the Trojan War stands on the boundary between legend and fact, a memory preserved in song while its documents turn to ash. The same pattern appears across time, empires and cities leaving traces in stone and story, but not in their own words. The Sahara, now an immense desert, once held entire civilizations, whose voices have vanished even more completely. Between 9000 and 3000 BC, the region was green. Monsoons swept north, feeding rivers, lakes and savannas where hippos wallowed and giraffes grazed. Rock art from the Tassili Niger and other regions depicts hunters, dancers, cattle and boats, scenes from a world of abundance. Settlements, burial mounds and tools show that people farmed, herded and fished across what is now one of Earth's most desolate landscapes. Then the climate changed. The rains withdrew, the grasslands turned to sand, and the peoples of the Green Sahara migrated. Some moved east toward the Nile, bringing cattle-herding traditions that may have influenced early Egypt. Others drifted south into sub-Saharan Africa, carrying languages and skills that reshaped regional cultures. The desert expanded over their homes, erasing villages and lakes alike. All that remains are rock paintings, fossils, and the outlines of vanished rivers revealed by satellite. In places like Niger's Gabbero, ancient graves with jewelry and shells tell of communities now long gone. The Sahara's lost cultures remind us that entire worlds can vanish, not through war, but through climate. What had been fertile ground became desert, burying histories that archaeology is only beginning to recover. Beneath the dunes lie the traces of forgotten societies, sealed away by time. Farther east, in Jordan, another desert tells a different story, one of survival through ingenuity. Petra, the Nabatean capital, is best known for its facades carved into rose-red cliffs, but its true marvel lies in its water system. By the 1st century AD, Petra was a thriving hub of the caravan trade, linking Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. To sustain its people, the Nabateans built a hidden network of channels, cisterns, and aqueducts that captured every drop of rain and runoff. Carved conduits traced the cliff faces, ceramic pipes ran beneath streets, and reservoirs stored enough water to feed gardens, fountains, and baths. Even in ruin, the system astonishes modern engineers. Covered channels minimized evaporation, settling basins filtered silt, and redundant pathways ensured steady supply. Archaeologists have mapped hundreds of cisterns and canals still intact after 2 millennia. Petra's prosperity depended as much on hydrology as on trade. Whoever controlled the water controlled the city. But the system could not outlast shifting trade routes and earthquakes. By the 3rd century, Petra's wealth declined as maritime commerce eclipsed desert caravans. Its monuments endured, but its lifeblood, the flow of water, dried up. India's Gupta Empire, centuries later and worlds away, faced the opposite problem: an abundance of creativity, but a scarcity of surviving records. From the 4th to 6th centuries AD, the Guptas presided over what later historians called a golden age. Mathematics, astronomy, literature, and art flourished. Aryabhata calculated pi and proposed Earth's rotation. Kalidasa wrote plays of exquisite language. Artists painted the Ajanta cave murals, visions of life and devotion preserved in stone. Yet the empire's own chronicles have vanished. The Guptas must have kept annals, scientific treatises, and legal codes. But their manuscripts, written on palm leaf and birch bark, decayed in India's humid climate. Invasions and time did the rest. What remains are scattered inscriptions, coins, and a few texts that survived by chance. The Allahabad pillar inscription praises Samudragupta's conquests in grand style, but it is propaganda, not history. Foreign visitors like the Chinese monk Faxian filled some gaps, describing a prosperous land of tolerance and learning. Yet even his account is only a glimpse. What survives captures brilliance without context. Aryabhata's formulas, but not his contemporaries' debates. Kalidasa's poetry, but not the court culture that sustained it. Ajanta's paintings, but not the records of their creation. Imagine the Gupta libraries that once held the full range of knowledge in science, medicine and philosophy, lost before the world could inherit them. Across Persia, Troy, the Sahara, Petra, and the Gupta Empire, the same truth recurs. Civilizations rise and leave traces, monuments, fragments, echoes, but their voices fade. The archives burn, the manuscripts rot, the dunes advance. What remains are glimpses: a courier's tablet, a bone inscription, a buried city, a mural on a temple wall. They remind us that history is built not just on what survives, but on what has vanished, and that the silence between the fragments is often as revealing as the words that endure. The Mochica civilization of northern Peru left no written record, yet their story is vividly told through clay, gold, and earth. Flourishing between about 100 and 700 AD along one of the driest coasts in the world. The Moche mastered irrigation, built monumental adobe pyramids, and created metalwork and ceramics of extraordinary sophistication. Their huacas, vast stepped pyramids like the Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna, were both administrative centers and sacred sites constructed from millions of sun-dried bricks. Excavations in the 20th century revealed murals, tombs, and offerings that showed a civilization of great wealth and complexity, organized into regional states united by shared traditions rather than a single empire. Moche art, especially pottery, serves as a narrative record. Their vessels illustrate scenes of agriculture, hunting, war, and myth with striking realism. Faces, rituals, and even intimate acts appear on their ceramics, giving a window into their daily and spiritual life. The level of portraiture suggests that some pieces depict actual people, perhaps rulers or priests, captured with remarkable individuality. Moche metalworkers were equally skilled, producing intricate ornaments of gold, silver, and copper, using techniques like gilding, alloying, and soldering centuries before these methods appeared in Europe. Their regalia, crowns, nose ornaments, jewelry, combine animal forms and sacred imagery, showing a world where political power and religion were inseparable. None of this would have been possible without water. The Moche engineered an elaborate network of canals that turned desert into farmland, feeding cities with maize, beans, and cotton. Their irrigation systems were feats of coordination and planning, linking entire valleys into unified hydraulic landscapes. But by around 700 AD, this prosperity unraveled. Sediment cores and ice records show that the region was struck by severe El Niño events, torrential floods followed by drought. Canals were destroyed, fields buried, and entire communities displaced. Archaeological layers reveal flood debris over irrigation channels, and at the same time, Moche murals began to depict scenes of human sacrifice and cosmic upheaval, perhaps desperate rituals to restore order. Without writing, archaeologists must interpret these fragments cautiously. Some pottery scenes that show bound prisoners and bleeding victims were once thought mythological, but excavations have uncovered sacrificial victims confirming that these rituals were real. The 1987 discovery of the Lord of Sipan's tomb, an intact royal burial rich in gold and silver, revealed a ruler whose regalia matched those painted on Moche vessels, linking art and life. Later discoveries at San Jose de Moro showed elite female burials with ceremonial items, evidence that women too held religious authority. The Moche story ends not with conquest, but with collapse. Climate instability, internal warfare, and political fragmentation likely combined to bring their civilization down. Yet their legacy endured through successor cultures such as the Lambayeque and Chimu, who inherited their irrigation systems and artistic traditions. Today, the Moche remain one of the most visible ancient peoples of the Andes, not through written words, but through the expressive power of their artifacts, which still speak from the desert. Across the Pacific in Korea, another culture left treasures that are equally mysterious: the gold crowns of Silla. Between the 4th and 7th centuries AD, Silla kings and queens were buried beneath great earthen mounds in Gyeongju, their tombs filled with jewelry, glassware, and crowns fashioned from sheets of hammered gold. These crowns, delicate and almost weightless, rise in tree-like and antler-like forms, decorated with hanging pendants and jade gogok beads. Their symbolism is unclear. They may represent the world tree, connecting heaven and earth, or embody royal authority fused with shamanic power. The Silla were one of Korea's three kingdoms, alongside Goguryeo and Baekje. Though initially peripheral, Silla became a major power through alliances and trade. Its capital a cosmopolitan hub linked to China, Japan, and Central Asia. The crown's intricate craftsmanship suggests both local innovation and outside influence, perhaps from Scythian or Siberian nomadic art traditions where gold and tree motifs were common. The jade beads, imported through long-distance trade, may symbolize vitality or divine energy. Some crowns have been found in women's tombs, implying that queens or priestesses shared ceremonial roles equal to men. These objects blur the line between politics and religion. The Silla ruler may have been seen not just as a sovereign, but as a mediator between worlds. Yet the lack of contemporary records leaves only speculation. Later chronicles written centuries afterward describe Silla kings within a Buddhist framework, but by then, the older shamanic traditions embodied in the crowns had faded. Each crown, fragile and luminous, holds symbols whose meanings are now only guessed. A golden forest standing over the graves of forgotten rulers. Centuries later, in Ming China, another kind of disappearance occurred, not of artifacts, but of knowledge. Admiral Zheng He, commanding the greatest fleet of his age, led 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433 that connected China with Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. His treasure ships were giants of wood and canvas, carrying tens of thousands of sailors, diplomats, and soldiers. They brought gifts of silk and porcelain, and returned with spices, gems, and exotic animals. Inscriptions and local records from Sri Lanka to Kenya testify to his presence, but within a century of his death, most of Zheng He's records were erased. The Ming dynasty, under new rulers wary of the eunuch faction he represented, ordered the expeditions discontinued. Shipyards fell silent, and detailed maps, logs, and reports were destroyed. Official histories reduced his achievements to brief mentions. The suppression was deliberate, a political decision to turn China inward and reclaim the Confucian ideal of a self-sufficient agrarian state. The result was one of the most dramatic acts of forgetting in history. What survives are fragments, inscriptions carved in stone, a few references in court annals, and scattered mentions in foreign accounts. We know his fleet reached Africa and the Persian Gulf, but we don't know exactly what treaties he made or what scientific and geographic knowledge he gathered. His ships, some over 100 meters long, were unmatched until the age of steam. If the lost logs still existed, they might show a map of the world, as seen from China's perspective, a world connected long before European exploration. Instead, the story ends with fire and silence, the deliberate burial of a maritime empire's memory. A century later, another body of records vanished for different reasons, the writings of Jesuit missionaries in China. Beginning in 1582, Matteo Ricci and his successors chronicled everything they encountered: astronomy, politics, philosophy, and daily life, bridging European and Chinese thought. They introduced Western science to the Ming and Qing courts and translated Confucian texts into Latin. Their letters and treatises circulated through Europe, shaping Enlightenment ideas about rational governance and secular ethics. Yet much of their output was confiscated or lost during religious and political conflicts. The Chinese rites controversy led to bans on Christianity, the expulsion of missionaries, and the seizure of manuscripts. Some were burned, others vanished into European archives, uncatalogued or forgotten. What remains, Ricci's world map, a handful of diaries and scattered letters, hints at an extraordinary record of cultural exchange. Jesuit reports inspired thinkers like Voltaire and Leibniz, who saw in China a model of moral reason without divine revelation. But for every surviving text, many more are missing: dictionaries, medical comparisons, and local ethnographies written in the field. These parallel stories, from the Mochica to Silla, from Zhenghe to the Jesuits, show how knowledge can vanish in different ways. Some losses come from nature and time, others from deliberate erasure or neglect. Yet the fragments that remain, vessels, crowns, inscriptions, and letters, still speak. They remind us that history is always incomplete, composed as much of silence as of words, and that every discovery, whether a gold crown or a buried manuscript, is a voice returning from the long quiet of the past. The real mystery is how much of China's story, as seen through Jesuit eyes, still lies hidden. Did these missionaries record customs, dialects, or political details that no Chinese chronicler ever wrote down? Did they preserve vanishing rituals or observations of court life that could reshape how we understand the Ming and Qing worlds? For nearly 2 centuries, Jesuits documented China in extraordinary detail, capturing a society at the height of its sophistication and global influence. Yet much of their work was confiscated, lost, or scattered. The fragments that survived transformed European thought, inspiring Enlightenment philosophers and altering the West's view of Asia. But the missing manuscripts suggest that there is still far more to uncover, a reminder of how easily centuries of careful observation can fade into obscurity. Not all erasure happens in archives or libraries. Sometimes history vanishes into the earth itself. For centuries, scholars dismissed the Amazon as a green desert, too infertile to sustain large-scale civilizations. Reports of organized cities along the river, recorded by early explorers, were ridiculed as fantasies. Yet modern science is now proving those early witnesses were closer to the truth than anyone imagined. Archaeological discoveries reveal that the Amazon once supported millions of people living in interconnected urban networks that reshaped the rainforest itself. The story begins with Francisco de Orellana, who in 1542 became the first European to travel the entire length of the Amazon. His accounts described towns, marketplaces, and cultivated fields stretching along the riverbanks. European readers doubted him. After all, the humid jungle seemed an unlikely cradle of civilization. For centuries, the accepted view was that the Amazon's nutrient-poor soil could not sustain large populations. Indigenous peoples were thought to have always lived in small, scattered communities. But that view began to crumble with the discovery of terra preta, black, fertile soil found across vast swaths of the rainforest. Unlike the natural acidic earth, this soil was man-made, created by mixing charcoal, organic matter, and pottery shards. It could sustain agriculture for centuries, proving that ancient Amazonians had engineered the land to feed large communities. Then came the earthworks. Deforestation exposed geometric patterns, circles, squares, and ditches stretching for hundreds of meters, often connected by straight roads. Radiocarbon dating placed them between 1000 and 1500 AD, long before European contact. These were not random clearings, but the remains of planned settlements. With the advent of LiDAR scanning, researchers began to see what had long been hidden beneath the trees: grids of roads, plazas, causeways, and clusters of towns laid out with mathematical precision. In some regions, dozens of sites were linked by causeways, radiating like spokes from central hubs. The Amazon, it turns out, was not wilderness. It was a landscape shaped by human hands. These societies combined farming, aquaculture, and forest management. They built raised fields to resist floods, engineered ponds for fish breeding, and planted orchards that became self-sustaining ecosystems. The forest we see today may itself be a legacy of this management, an ancient garden mistaken for untouched wilderness. What destroyed these societies was not ecological failure, but disease. Epidemics of smallpox, influenza, and measles spread through early coastal contact, swept through the interior before most Europeans arrived. Populations collapsed, cities emptied, and the jungle reclaimed what remained. When later explorers came, they saw only isolated villages and assumed there had never been more. Now, with LiDAR and soil analysis, archaeologists estimate that only a fraction of the Amazon has been surveyed. Beneath its canopy may lie hundreds of undiscovered city networks, each a silent record of a civilization erased before history could remember it. These revelations are transforming how we view indigenous knowledge. The people once dismissed as primitive were, in fact, engineers of one of Earth's most complex ecosystems. The tragedy is that their descendants inherited the forest, but not the memory of how it was built. A similar rediscovery is unfolding in Cambodia. Angkor Wat, the great temple that crowns the Khmer legacy, was once thought to be a lone marvel surrounded by jungle. Modern research reveals it was the heart of a sprawling metropolis, sustained by one of the most intricate hydraulic systems in the pre-modern world. Canals, reservoirs, and embankments transformed monsoon rains into an engine that fed nearly 1 million people. For centuries, Angkor thrived as a center of art, religion, and power. Then by the 15th century it was abandoned, its temples swallowed by forest. LiDAR mapping has shown that Angkor was not a city of temples alone, but an immense urban grid of neighborhoods, roads, and fields extending for hundreds of square kilometers. Its reservoirs, the barrays, were colossal, some larger than modern airports, holding tens of millions of cubic meters of water. The system allowed year-round farming in a region governed by erratic monsoons. But this brilliance carried its own fragility. Prolonged droughts, followed by floods in the 14th and 15th centuries, shattered the delicate balance. Dikes collapsed, canals silted up, and the hydraulic system broke under the weight of its own complexity. Political instability and wars with neighboring states hastened the decline. Over time, the city emptied, leaving its temples as monuments to an empire undone by the very water it once controlled. When explorers rediscovered Angkor centuries later, they found only stone spires entangled with roots, a haunting image of nature reclaiming the works of human hands. Today, satellites and LiDAR expose the full extent of its former grandeur, showing just how vast and advanced Angkor truly was. It's a story of success pushed to collapse, of mastery over nature that could not survive the climate's change. In the deserts of Arabia, another hidden history is being rewritten. Long before Islam, the peninsula was home to powerful kingdoms, Nabatea, Lihian, and Himyar, whose wealth came from trade in incense and spices. Their temples, inscriptions, and fortresses once dotted the landscape. Yet for centuries, their legacy was dismissed as little more than a prelude to Islam. Only recently have archaeologists begun to grasp their sophistication. In the north, the Nabateans built Petra, carving monumental tombs into red cliffs and controlling the caravan routes from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. To the south, in Yemen, the Himyarite kingdom traded with Rome, Persia, and Africa, its ships crossing the Indian Ocean long before Islam's rise. Across Arabia, thousands of inscriptions in ancient scripts still cover cliffs and wadis, prayers, dedications, and royal proclamations. But early Islamic chroniclers, eager to define a new religious era, called the pre-Islamic age Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance. Pagan temples were abandoned and oral traditions faded. The result was cultural amnesia. Entire dynasties and centuries of history slipped from memory. Now, with modern archaeology, Arabia's forgotten kingdoms are re-emerging. Excavations at Alula and elsewhere reveal tombs and temples rivaling those of neighboring civilizations. Carved graffiti in Safaitic and Thamudic scripts record everyday lives, shepherds, travelers, and kings, offering a chorus of voices long ignored. The incense caravans that once crossed the desert fed Rome's temples and Persia's altars, tying Arabia to global trade networks. Yet the full story still lies untranslated, written on rock faces stretching from Jordan to Yemen. Arabia before Islam was no barren wilderness, but a crossroads of cultures, now slowly reclaiming its place in world history. Farther north, in Central Asia, lies another forgotten civilization, one that had no writing at all. In the 1970s, Soviet archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Bronze Age culture beneath the deserts of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. Known today as the Bactria-Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC, it flourished between 2300 and 1700 BC and boasted fortified cities, palaces, temples, and sophisticated metalwork. At sites like Gonur Tepe, massive mud-brick fortresses stood in the sand, their walls enclosing courtyards and fire altars. Artifacts of gold, silver, and lapis lazuli revealed connections stretching from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. No texts have been found, no tablets, seals, or inscriptions. Yet the evidence of trade, architecture, and ritual suggests a highly organized society. The fire altars discovered at Gonur resemble those used millennia later in Zoroastrian worship, hinting that BMAC may have influenced or prefigured later Iranian religions. The absence of writing leaves everything open to speculation. Who ruled these cities, what language they spoke, and what myths they told. By around 1700 BC, their settlements were abandoned, perhaps due to environmental shifts or migrations. Their fortresses crumbled, and their memory vanished until archaeologists unearthed them again 3,000 years later. The BMAC is a reminder that even without texts, civilizations can achieve extraordinary sophistication, and that history often survives not in words, but in the materials of daily life. Gold cups, fire altars, beads of lapis traded across continents. Each find adds a fragment to the mosaic of human memory. But the picture is still incomplete. From the Jesuits' missing manuscripts to the buried cities of the Amazon, from the hydraulic collapse of Angkor to the vanished kingdoms of Arabia and the nameless fortresses of Central Asia, history is as much about what we've lost as what we know. Every ruin, every inscription, every rediscovered city reminds us how fragile the record of humanity really is. For all our knowledge, we are still surrounded by silences, stories erased, buried, or simply forgotten, waiting for someone to listen again.